They told you the way to stop negative thoughts was to think more, to argue with your mind, to fix it, to control every dark feeling before it takes over. But if that worked, why does the overthinking never stop? Why does your mind still race at night, spinning stories you didn't ask for, dragging you into past regrets and future fears you can't escape? The truth is, silence doesn't come from control. It comes from letting go. And no one teaches that better than Buddhism. For thousands of years, Buddhist monks and masters have trained their minds not by fighting thoughts, but by watching them, sitting with them, and realizing one powerful truth. You are not your thoughts. You are the stillness beneath them, the sky behind the clouds, the awareness that never wavers, even when the storm is loud. Tonight, that storm begins to quiet. As you listen to these lessons, something deep inside you will shift. That voice in your head, the one that's always doubting, always worrying, always replaying everything that went wrong, will start to lose its power. Not because you silenced it with force, but because you finally saw through it. You'll begin to feel a peace you didn't know was possible. The kind of peace that doesn't depend on anyone else. The kind that doesn't leave when things go wrong. The kind that waits quietly inside you, like a mountain unmoved by the wind. This isn't just background noise to fall asleep to. This is ancient truth. This is a new relationship with your mind. This is the night you stop trying to outrun your thoughts and finally learn to sit above them. Are you ready? Let's begin. So now that you know this isn't just noise to fall asleep to, but a process that might just rewire the way your mind handles negativity, let's go deeper. Because before you can let go of negative thoughts, you need to understand where they really begin. Not when they speak, not when they shout, but right before they exist. There's something hiding beneath the surface of your thoughts, and once you learn to see it, everything starts to change. It's not the loud thoughts that trap you, it's the quiet ones, the ones that show up as a feeling in the chest, a shift in your breath, a wave of discomfort that arrives before words even form. This is the noise behind the noise, the part of your mind that starts writing the story before you even know you're reading it. And if you don't slow down enough to hear it, you'll always be reacting to something you never actually saw. Most people only notice their thoughts when they're loud, when the criticism is sharp, when the anxiety is racing, when the sadness is thick. But those are just the final product, the sentence after the spark. Buddhist introspection teaches us that every thought has a beginning, a small ripple, a flicker in the mind that we miss because we're already caught in the reaction. And if you don't train your awareness to catch it early, it becomes automatic. That's how the mind builds habits. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for your approval. It just keeps looping quietly until what once felt like a passing mood becomes a way of life. But the good news is the loop can be broken, not by force, not by fighting, but by noticing. This is where Buddhist practice becomes more than just stillness. It becomes skill, the skill of seeing the beginning before the storm. That strange tightness in the throat before anxiety builds. That small drop of irritation before the story of blame begins. That mental tension before the voice of self-doubt even starts to speak. In Buddhist meditation, this level of awareness is not a superpower. It's normal. It's trained, and it's accessible to anyone who's willing to slow down enough to feel what comes before the noise. You might think awareness means knowing what you're thinking, but it's more than that. It means knowing what starts the thinking, that subtle discomfort that makes the mind want to reach for a distraction, that unease that pushes the brain to start solving problems that don't even exist. That's the level where negative thoughts are born. And if you can meet them there, with silence, with curiosity, with space, you stop them from becoming something bigger. Here's where most people get it wrong. They wait until the thought has already taken shape. They argue with it. They push it away. They try to replace it. But by then, it's already too late. That's like waiting until a wildfire is burning your house before you go looking for the match. The deeper practice is catching the flicker before the flame. The reason this works is because your thoughts aren't as solid as they feel. They're not permanent. They're not even that personal. They're like wind. They move. They shift. They don't stay unless you hold on to them. But the moment a thought shows up and the mind says, "This is mine," now you're attached. And attachment is how thoughts grow teeth. So the practice here is to notice the subtle vibration of thought before the mind grabs it, before the label, before the judgment, before the story. And here's the trick. When you really see the beginning of a thought, you realize you didn't create it. You didn't summon it. You didn't choose it. It just appeared out of nowhere. Which means it's not you. It's not your fault. It's not something to feel bad about. It's just a passing current in the stream of mind. And when you see it that way, you're no longer drowning in it. You're standing at the shore, watching the current move by. This is what changes everything. Because when you know you're not the voice in your head, the voice loses its control. And when you can notice the voice before it even speaks, you have the power to stay silent. Not as a shutdown, but as a clear seeing. A choice to not react. A choice to not believe. A choice to remain still and free. Think about it like this. Let's say a negative thought starts with a memory. But what triggered that memory? Maybe it was a smell, a sound, a color, a glance. Something so small the mind didn't register it consciously, but the body did. The breath shifted, the heart rate changed, and in that tiny window, your nervous system sent a message to your mind. Something's off. That's when the pre-thought was born. That's the moment the loop begins. And if no one is watching, the mind fills that space with a familiar story, one it's told 1,000 times before. So the practice isn't to stop memories. You can't. It's to notice that micro moment when a memory tries to shape your mood. To notice the very first response. Not the thought, but the impulse. And that's something only silence can show you. Not silence on the outside, but silence on the inside. The kind you build through meditation, through breath, through a willingness to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. This silence is not emptiness. It's power. It's the space that shows you what's real before the noise tries to cover it. Because every negative thought has a structure, a beginning, a rise, a climax. And if you catch it before it builds, you take away the energy that fuels it. Think of your mind like a radio. Most people are stuck on a station they didn't choose, listening to mental commentary that's been playing for years. But what if you could hear the static before the song starts? What if you could turn down the volume at the source, not just cover it up with affirmations or distractions? Buddhist awareness teaches this kind of tuning. You learn to feel the subtle signals, the breath tightening, the muscles tensing, the restlessness in your seat. And when you learn to catch those early cues, the mind doesn't need to spin stories anymore. You've already acknowledged what's rising, and when awareness meets rising energy, something softens, something loosens. The thought loses its bite because it was never given the chance to sharpen its teeth. This practice is not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming present. The goal isn't to eliminate all negative thoughts. The goal is to stop giving them power before they even exist. And that's done through observation, through patience, through sitting still and listening not just to what the mind says, but to what it almost says. That's the true silence. That's the real freedom. Now, here's something profound. Buddhist texts say that thoughts arise dependent on causes and conditions. They're not random. They don't come from nowhere. They appear when the right inner climate allows them. So if your mind is cloudy, heavy, tired, certain thoughts will bloom. But if your mind is still, balanced, and attentive, those same thoughts have no soil to grow in. This is why daily practice matters, because you're not just calming your mind, you're changing the conditions that allow certain thoughts to survive. You might not see results in one night, but every time you practice, you get closer to that clarity. You build the skill of noticing faster, and over time, noticing becomes second nature. You stop reacting to everything, you stop believing every thought, and eventually you live more in the space between thoughts than inside them. That's when you know you're really free. So tonight, as your eyes close and your breath slows, let this become your practice, not to force silence, but to notice the noise behind the noise, to feel the early signs, to hear the soft voice before it speaks, and to rest, not in resistance, but in awareness. The thoughts may still come, but they'll come to a different kind of mind, a mind that sees, a mind that listens, and most importantly, a mind that no longer reacts. Let that be your new way of being. So, now that the subtle layer beneath your thoughts has been exposed, that quiet shift, that unspoken spark that begins it all, it's time to face something even deeper. Because once you start listening with that level of stillness, something strange happens. Memories you haven't thought of in years begin to stir. Emotions you thought were long gone begin to resurface. Not because you're broken, not because you're doing it wrong, but because silence is the only environment where the past finally feels safe enough to rise. What you're hearing isn't failure, it's feedback. These aren't new thoughts, they're old echoes, fragments of unprocessed experience that have been waiting for stillness to find their way home. There are wounds the body forgets, but the mind remembers, not in words, not in pictures, but in patterns, in the sudden anxiety that has no name, in the tightness that shows up during meditation and won't leave, in the sadness that floats in without a clear cause. This is what Buddhism calls the residue of clinging, and silence doesn't suppress it, it reveals it. For most of life, distractions do a great job of keeping the past buried. Activity, entertainment, achievement, chaos, all of it forms a protective layer over unresolved emotions. But when those layers are stripped away through stillness, what's left is not peace at first. What's left is the mess that was never fully felt. The mind begins to ring with old echoes, not to punish, but to be heard, to be released. That's why meditation is not always peaceful. In the beginning, it can feel like the opposite, because the silence doesn't just calm the surface, it wakes the depths. And what lives in those depths? Emotions that never completed their journey, anger that wasn't expressed, grief that wasn't honored, fear that got buried under strength. They don't just disappear, they wait. And when the noise stops, they rise like forgotten songs, echoing through the chambers of the mind. This isn't regression. This is purification. The resurfacing of old emotion isn't a setback. It's a process. Buddhism teaches that every thought, every emotion leaves a trace. And if it's not fully seen, it lingers. It embeds itself into the structure of your reactions. It whispers from behind the curtain. And eventually, it plays itself out again and again through present experience. This is why someone can feel deep sadness from a song or intense fear in a safe room. The body is still listening to echoes the mind never understood. But the silence you're practicing now, it becomes the space where those echoes don't take over. They don't have to be acted on. They can simply arise, pass through, and fade. Just like a sound in a valley, it starts strong, bounces once, then disappears. That's what happens when old emotions are met with awareness instead of resistance. They complete their arc, and once they do, they don't return. It's important to know this isn't about analyzing the past. This isn't therapy. This isn't about digging into every memory or labeling every feeling. It's about presence, total presence. Feeling without running, observing without judgment, letting whatever arises rise without adding to it. Because when you stop adding, the mind stops clinging, and what it stops clinging to, it stops carrying. The biggest mistake people make when emotions resurface is trying to figure them out. They start building stories, looking for reasons, assigning blame, finding patterns. But none of that is necessary. Emotions don't need explanations. They need space. The same way a wound doesn't need you to describe it. It just needs to breathe. Silence is that breath. Awareness is that oxygen. Think of the mind like a cave. Every word, every memory, every heartbreak, if unprocessed, becomes an echo bouncing off the walls. And until those echoes meet stillness, they keep bouncing. That's why emotional triggers feel so automatic. The past keeps playing itself through the present because it hasn't yet met a moment strong enough to absorb it. That's what this practice becomes, a space strong enough to catch the emotion and stop the bounce. Buddhism doesn't ask you to become immune to emotion. It teaches you to stop being enslaved by it. And this starts with understanding that emotion is not the enemy. Reaction is. Repetition is. When the same emotion rises again and again and turns into an identity, that's when suffering begins. But when it's seen clearly, with softness, with breath, it dissolves. It finishes what it started. One of the most powerful tools in this process is breath, because breath grounds you in the present, even as echoes of the past arise. As the mind begins to stir with old sensations, breathing anchors you, not to control, but to feel fully without drowning. Every breath says, "This too can pass." Every exhale becomes a release of the weight that was never yours to hold forever. And if tears come, let them come. If your body trembles, let it tremble. These are not breakdowns. These are breakthroughs. The nervous system unfreezing, the heart exhaling, the emotional system reorganizing itself after years of holding. What silence opens, the body completes. That is healing. This isn't always a fast process. Some emotions are sticky. They're tied to events that shaped your view of the world. So when they surface, it can feel like your identity is being questioned. And in a way, it is, because many identities are built around what hurt us, around what we survived, around the stories we told ourselves to cope. But in Buddhist practice, those identities are seen for what they are: temporary, protective, but not permanent. They helped you once, but now they can be released. And as those identities soften, new space opens. You begin to respond differently. What used to trigger defensiveness now meets patience. What used to bring guilt now brings forgiveness. Not through effort, but through seeing. You've met the echo, felt it fully, and let it pass. Some days, nothing rises. Other days, it feels like a flood. That's normal. Healing isn't linear, and silence doesn't guarantee comfort. It guarantees truth. The echo of an old betrayal might rise when you're finally still enough to feel it. The sting of an old rejection might show up in the quiet of your breath. But instead of pushing it down again, this time you sit with it. You breathe with it, and without effort, it starts to melt. In Buddhism, this process is known as purification of the mind. Not by suppressing thoughts, but by allowing them to show themselves and burn out. Like watching fire consume dry wood. If you don't feed it more fuel, it goes out. That's what happens when you stop reacting and simply observe. And here's something even deeper. Many of the emotions that rise aren't even yours. Some of them are inherited, passed down through culture, through family, through the energetic fields you grew up in. That means you might be carrying shame that never started with you, fear that belonged to someone else, guilt that came from someone else's mistake. But once it surfaces and you see it clearly, it loses its power. The illusion ends. The chain breaks. This is why stillness isn't weak. It's radical. Because in a world that tells you to distract, to fix, to control, choosing to be still with your own pain is the bravest thing you can do. And it's also the most healing, because it's the only thing that finally says, "This ends with me." So as these echoes rise, let them speak, let them shake your ribs if they need to. Let the past have its voice, not so it can stay, but so it can leave. And know this, once the echo fades, it doesn't come back. Not the same way, not with the same weight. It's not repressed, it's released. That's the power of this practice. Not the silence that hides, but the silence that reveals. Not the stillness that avoids, but the stillness that transforms. You're not going backward, you're clearing space. You're rewriting your relationship with your own mind by letting the past speak, be heard, and be released. Let the next breath in be the start of that freedom. So, after letting the old emotions rise and fall without resistance, after watching echoes from the past surface and dissolve, you begin to notice something else. something quieter but more persistent. A voice, not just one that visits in silence, but one that follows you throughout your day. The one that tells you you're not enough, that you should have done better, that you always mess things up. It sounds like your own thoughts, but there's something off about it, because deep down it doesn't feel like you, and that's because it isn't. It never was. That inner critic, the one that whispers shame, fuels anxiety, and strips confidence, is not your true voice. It's a ghost, a leftover imprint of the things you were taught to believe about yourself. It's learned, rehearsed, adopted. And in the Buddhist path, one of the most important forms of freedom is learning how to see through it. Not by arguing with it, not by pretending it's not there, but by finally disidentifying from it. Because you can't silence something you still believe is part of you. The critic has a familiar tone for a reason. It mimics voices you've heard before: teachers, parents, authority figures, culture. Over time, those voices don't stay outside. They move in. And the brain, trying to protect you, starts repeating them like warnings. Don't do that. You'll fail. You shouldn't feel that way. You're too sensitive. You're not doing enough. These aren't your insights. They're echoes dressed as wisdom, and they become habits of thought that feel like personality. Buddhist self-inquiry teaches that identity is not fixed, that the self is not one thing. It's a constantly shifting process, shaped by conditions, beliefs, experiences. So when the critic speaks, it's not truth, it's just conditioning, and if it was learned, it can be unlearned. The first step is awareness. Noticing that the voice is speaking is already a shift, because when you're caught in the story, you don't even question it. You just feel small, guilty, anxious. But the moment you become the observer of that story, you take your power back. Now, you're not the character being judged. You're the witness seeing the judgment arise. And what you start to realize is this: the critic always has a script. It says the same things in the same tone with the same assumptions. It never says, maybe you're doing just fine. It never says, you're allowed to rest. It never encourages curiosity, growth, or compassion. Its job is to maintain control through fear, through comparison, through punishment. It speaks in absolutes. It wants perfection. And when you start seeing that pattern clearly, you stop believing it's helping you. In Buddhist practice, we use something called mindful inquiry to explore thoughts like these. Instead of running from the critic, you turn toward it. You ask it questions. Where did you come from? Whose voice is this really? What are you trying to protect me from? This is not about indulging the critic, it's about exposing it. Because once you shine light on it, it loses the power of invisibility. Many times, what the critic is trying to do is keep you safe. Safe from rejection, safe from failure, safe from vulnerability. But it does it in the harshest way possible. It assumes the worst, so you'll never be disappointed. But the cost is high, because that kind of protection suffocates. It shrinks your sense of self. It poisons joy. It makes growth feel like danger instead of freedom. One of the most powerful realizations in Buddhism is that suffering arises from clinging. And many people cling to the critic because they believe it keeps them responsible, keeps them motivated. But there's a difference between awareness and abuse, between discipline and self-attack. You don't become stronger by beating yourself up. You become stronger by meeting your flaws with truth and compassion at the same time. The critic never does both. And here's something deep. When you stop identifying with the critic, you stop fueling it. Every time you react to it, believe it, argue with it, or try to prove it wrong, you feed it attention. But when you simply notice it and say, "Ah, there's that voice again," without engaging, it starts to fade. Not immediately, but over time, it shows up less. It becomes quieter, because it's not being rewarded with belief. That's what Buddhist detachment really means here. Not pretending the critic isn't real, but refusing to merge with it, to see it as an old recording, not something to fight, just something to let pass, like a cloud crossing the sky. You don't yell at the cloud, you just watch it go. The more you do this, the more spacious the mind becomes. New thoughts begin to appear, not ones forced through effort, but ones that arise naturally once the critic no longer dominates the conversation. Thoughts of ease, of possibility, of humor even, because when you're no longer policing yourself internally, you're free to be more than your defenses. There's a Buddhist teaching that says, "Don't believe everything you think," and nowhere is that more relevant than with the inner critic. Just because it's loud doesn't mean it's right. Just because it feels familiar doesn't mean it belongs. Just because it's in your head doesn't mean it's part of your truth. One practice that helps here is labeling. When the voice starts, you simply say internally, "judging," or "critic." That single word creates distance. It breaks the illusion that the thought is personal. It becomes just another mental event. And like any other event, it passes when you stop resisting it or acting on it. Another technique is replacing self-judgment with curiosity. Instead of, "What's wrong with me?" try, "What's happening inside me right now?" That simple change softens everything. Curiosity opens space. Judgment closes it. And space is where healing happens. You can also ask, "What would I say to a friend who had this thought?" Almost always, the answer is gentler, more grounded, more compassionate than what you say to yourself. So why the double standard? That's the critic's trick. It convinces you that you deserve less kindness than others, but that's not insight. It's trauma repeating itself, and once you catch it, you can change it. Sometimes the critic doesn't even speak in words. It shows up as tension, as pressure, as the inability to rest without guilt. That's still self-punishment, just quieter. So part of this work is learning to feel those signals in the body and offering them release, through breath, through stillness, through movement, through permission to just be, without earning it. It's also helpful to remember that letting go of the critic doesn't mean losing your standards. You can still grow, still evolve, but from love, not shame, from excitement, not fear. Buddhist compassion includes wisdom. It doesn't mean letting yourself off the hook for everything. It means seeing clearly without adding poison. One of the most healing things you can do is look at yourself through the eyes of non-judging awareness, to sit with your flaws and not flinch, to notice your habits and not collapse into guilt, to say, "This is what's here, and it's okay." That doesn't mean it stays forever. It means it doesn't have to be attacked to be seen. And as you practice this, you might notice something beautiful, The critic starts to sound less like a judge and more like a scared part of you that needs love. And when you meet it that way, with softness instead of resistance, it finally relaxes. Because what it wanted all along was safety. And now it has it, because you're no longer fighting yourself, you're listening. So tonight, as your body softens and your breath steadies, let this be the beginning of a new relationship with your inner voice. One where awareness replaces judgment, where silence replaces shouting, where kindness takes the place of punishment. You don't need to be perfect to be at peace. You only need to see clearly. And once you do, the critic becomes what it's always been, a ghost. One you no longer fear, one you can finally let go of. So now that you've seen through the critic, exposed it as something learned, not innate, you're left with something even more mysterious. The thought stream itself. Not just negative thoughts, but all thoughts. The endless movement of mind that shifts shape depending on mood, memory, and moment. It's always changing. But because the change is constant, most people don't notice it. They chase the content. They react to every form it takes. And in doing so, they never see the truth, that the mind itself is a shapeshifter. Thoughts don't stay the same. They twist, they flip, they contradict themselves. One minute you're angry, the next you're sad. One moment you're confident, and the next, doubt creeps in. And none of it is stable. Buddhism points directly at this reality, not to confuse you, but to free you. Because once you see that thoughts are not fixed, you stop clinging to them like they're facts. Every emotion, every story in your head has a rhythm. It rises, peaks, and fades. But when you're caught inside a thought, it feels like it will last forever. That's the illusion, and it's only through observation that the illusion starts to break down. The practice is to watch, not just the thought itself, but how the thought changes. To notice how what felt urgent one moment becomes irrelevant the next. How a judgment can turn into compassion. How fear can turn into laughter. Not because you forced it, but because the nature of thought is movement. The mistake is thinking that one version of the mind is you, that the anxious version is the real you, or the angry one, or the insecure one. But all of them pass, all of them shift, and if they were really you, they wouldn't leave, they'd stay, but they don't. And that's the secret doorway out of suffering. When you sit with your thoughts long enough, you begin to see them like waves on water. They rise, take shape, and fall. And if you're not resisting them, they move cleanly through. But the moment you try to control them, stop them, or argue with them, you get caught in the current. You start reacting to the shape they've taken, instead of seeing that it will change soon anyway. Buddhist meditation trains the mind to observe this shifting with calm, not to stop the thoughts, but to stop identifying with every version that shows up. One moment you're hopeful, the next you're doubting. Let both be seen. Let both pass. Because neither is final, neither defines you. They're weather patterns, not architecture. This is where your power grows. Because if you can see a thought shift, you don't take it as absolute truth anymore. You don't let it pull you into impulsive action. You don't let it drag you into regret or fear. You pause. You notice. You say, there it is, and now it's changing. That moment of observation is where freedom lives. That's where your real self, the one behind all the shifting forms, starts to wake up. One of the deepest teachings in Buddhism is anicca, impermanence. Everything changes, including your mind, including your mood, including the thoughts that felt so convincing just a minute ago. And when you can watch that change without reacting, your relationship with yourself begins to transform. You stop being afraid of your own mind, because you've seen it shapeshift too many times to take it so seriously. Let's say you wake up with anxiety. The thought says, something's wrong, and you believe it. Now your whole day feels heavy. But if you watch long enough, that thought morphs. It becomes, maybe I'll be okay. Then it turns into, I'm tired. Then, I want coffee. And suddenly the anxiety has become background noise. That's the nature of thought. It doesn't stay loyal to one story. It jumps. It flips. It recycles. So why treat the first version as final? When you practice stillness, you start catching these shifts in real time. You see the sadness turn into numbness. You see the restlessness soften into calm. You see the mental storm weaken before it passes. And each time you witness that change, your belief in permanence weakens too. That's how you stop being a prisoner of your mind, not by controlling the thoughts, but by watching them change until you no longer fear their arrival. This doesn't mean you suppress how you feel. It means you give it space to breathe and change on its own, because most of the damage comes not from the thought itself, but from clinging to it, saying, "This is how I feel, and it will always be this way." But it never is. And once you start seeing that for yourself, something inside you becomes unshakable. Not because you're never sad, but because you know sadness will pass. Not because you're never angry, but because you no longer build a home inside anger. You see it come. You see it go. There's another important layer to this. The mind doesn't just shape-shift randomly. It shifts based on attention. Where you place your awareness influences how thoughts evolve. If you focus on a complaint, the mind feeds that shape. If you shift toward breath or sound or gratitude, the mind begins to soften. It takes a new form. So this practice isn't passive. It's deeply engaged. You're not just watching, you're choosing, moment by moment, not to follow every form the mind takes. Thoughts will still arise, but the choice is yours. Follow, fight, or watch. And in the watching, you reclaim energy. You take back the power that used to go into reacting, into overthinking, into trying to control what was never meant to be held. What begins to emerge in this space is stillness. Not because the mind stops moving, but because you stop moving with it. The thoughts swirl, but you remain grounded. They flicker, but you remain steady. And this steadiness becomes your new baseline. One that isn't built on avoiding negative thoughts, but on seeing through their illusion of solidity. This is not indifference. This is clarity. You still feel, still care, still act when needed. But now you act from choice, not reaction, from presence, not panic, from understanding, not confusion. There will be moments where the mind takes a shape that feels overwhelming, a wave of fear, a spike of anger, a rush of insecurity. But even then, you watch, you breathe, you don't merge. You don't become the thought. You let it be a visitor, not a master. And like all visitors, it eventually leaves. The more you practice this, the more flexible the mind becomes. And a flexible mind is a peaceful one. It bends with emotion, but doesn't break. It moves with thought, but doesn't get swept away. And that's what resilience really is. Not rigid control, but fluid awareness. You begin to understand the mind is not the problem. Reactivity is, and reactivity fades in the presence of observation. Stillness is not a lack of thought. It's the space that holds thought without becoming it. And that space is always available, right now, in this breath, in this moment. So tonight, as your thoughts begin their nightly dance, shifting from worry to memory, to planning to doubt, let them shift, let them morph, let them pass. You don't need to hold them, you don't need to fight them. Just see them for what they are, temporary forms, nothing more. And in that seeing, you'll find the part of you that doesn't change. So, after seeing the way thoughts shift their shape, how they rise, change, and dissolve without warning, you might feel a strange sense of relief. But also, maybe a question starts forming. If thoughts aren't solid, why do the same ones keep coming back? Why do certain patterns repeat like a song stuck on loop? Why do some thoughts feel more like habits than anything helpful? That's where we go next. Because sometimes the thoughts we believe are telling us the truth are just telling us what we've rehearsed. The human mind is a creature of habit. Not because it's broken, but because it's designed to protect, to predict, to simplify. Repeating thoughts are one of its shortcuts. They create familiar pathways, so you don't have to figure everything out from scratch. But when those pathways are rooted in fear, shame, or confusion, they become traps. You start thinking in circles. You revisit the same doubts, the same fears, the same worries, not because they're real, but because they're familiar. In Buddhism, this is referred to as samsara, repetition driven by clinging. Not just clinging to things, but clinging to thoughts. Mental loops are often mistaken for logic, but really they're echoes of unexamined beliefs. And the more you engage them, the deeper the groove becomes, like walking the same trail every day until the path digs itself into the earth. You might not notice it at first. It can start subtly. You feel anxious, so your mind searches for reasons. Maybe it finds one. Then it repeats it. Soon, it's the default explanation for how you feel. But the truth is, the thought didn't cause the anxiety. The anxiety pulled the thought from memory, like an old file. The loop begins when you believe the thought is the source instead of the symptom. So how do you break the cycle? Not by force, not by arguing with yourself, but by practicing non-clinging. That's the heart of this lesson, to see thought, not as command, not as truth, not as proof of failure. Just mental activity, just the mind doing what it's been trained to do. And the moment you stop grabbing onto it, something incredible happens. The loop loses momentum. The habit of thought thrives on engagement. Every time you argue with it, believe it, analyze it, you're feeding it energy. But when you meet the thought with space, with quiet observation, with disinterest, it begins to fade. Not repressed, not ignored, just allowed to pass without being fed. That's the core of non-clinging. It doesn't mean you deny what arises. It means you don't build a house there. One of the ways you can begin to notice a loop is through repetition of emotional tone. The story might change slightly, but the feeling it creates is the same. That's a sign you're not discovering something new, you're recycling. And recycling thoughts only feel convincing because they've been rehearsed. Like a song played 1,000 times, the brain knows it by heart. But repetition isn't the same as truth. Buddhist insight encourages this kind of seeing. When a thought comes, you ask, is this fresh or is this familiar? Is this clear seeing or is this pattern? And often, the answer becomes obvious when you slow down. You'll notice that the mind likes to return to what it knows, even if what it knows hurts. Not because it wants pain, but because it finds comfort in the known. And your work is to introduce something unfamiliar. Silence, patience, space. Cognitive loops are like wheels that spin only because they've never been interrupted. They rely on momentum, but if you stop pushing, the wheel slows, the pattern softens, the voice grows quieter. It may return, but each time you meet it with stillness, it becomes less compelling, less urgent. Until one day, it shows up and you barely notice. That's when you know something inside has changed. The loops don't only form in thought, they root themselves in emotion, in body tension, in nervous system response. That's why breaking them isn't only mental, it's embodied. You learn to feel the trigger before the thought arrives. You feel the jaw tighten, the chest constrict, the restlessness creep in. And in that moment, before the loop begins, you choose to stay with the body, with breath, with the present moment. That's where the loop loses its power. Letting go doesn't mean losing awareness. It means shifting the way you hold what arises. You stop gripping. You stop wrapping your identity around every passing thought. And when you stop believing that every thought demands your attention, you free up an enormous amount of energy. Energy that was being used to chase, fix, fear, and explain. Now it's available for clarity, for peace, for presence. Some loops are linked to deeper conditioning, maybe from childhood, maybe from relationships, maybe from trauma. That makes them louder, more convincing. But even those can be unraveled. Not all at once, but moment by moment. Every time you notice the beginning of the loop, every time you pause instead of react, you interrupt the circuitry. You create a new possibility. One where you don't have to keep telling yourself the same story. This isn't about thinking positive. It's about seeing clearly. Non-clinging doesn't require you to replace one thought with another. It invites you to step outside the cycle entirely, to see the thoughts as clouds in the sky, some dark, some light, all passing. And when you become the sky instead of the cloud, the patterns stop defining you. You don't have to solve every thought. That's the old training. The need to fix, to analyze, to understand endlessly. But the deeper wisdom knows, not all thoughts are meant to be followed. Some are just noise. Some are the mind clearing itself out. And when you allow them to arise and pass, without building a reaction, they complete themselves and leave. In practice, this might look like sitting with restlessness and not rushing to label it. Not building a story, just feeling the energy move. Watching the thoughts form and fade, not clinging to the judgment, not attaching to the meaning, just letting them move like wind through open space. Over time, this becomes natural. You start recognizing loops the moment they begin. You feel their tone, you hear their rhythm, and instead of tightening, you soften. Instead of believing, you breathe. And that gap between stimulus and reaction, that's your freedom. That's the space where transformation begins. There is no loop that can't be broken. But they won't break through willpower alone. They dissolve in the presence of awareness that no longer grabs. Awareness that watches. Awareness that waits. Awareness that whispers, "This isn't me. This is a habit, and I'm done feeding it." You'll still think, the mind will still move, but now you'll know the difference between a thought and a truth, between momentum and meaning, between pattern and presence. And in that knowing, the weight lifts. So as your thoughts move tonight, if one shows up that feels too familiar, too automatic, too loud, pause. Don't fight. Don't follow. Just notice. Is this thought true? Or is it just old? Is it alive? Or is it just rehearsed? And then return to your breath, to the stillness underneath, to the version of you that doesn't need to explain anything, that just watches and lets go. Now that you've seen how thought patterns can repeat without being true, how loops of belief can run silently in the background, you're ready to face the next challenge. Because once those habits lose their grip, something strange happens. They don't always vanish quietly. Sometimes they flare up. They push harder. They swirl faster. The mind doesn't want to let go without a fight. This is what many people mistake for failure. But it's not failure, it's just weather. Your thoughts, your moods, your feelings, they move like skies over the earth. One moment clear, the next cloudy. Sometimes peaceful, sometimes wild. But the earth doesn't panic when the storm rolls in. It stays. It holds. That's your new role now. Not to change the storm, but to remain still beneath it. Buddhist teachings speak often of the mind as sky and thoughts as weather. The key isn't to resist the clouds or run from the rain. It's to understand that what's happening inside you isn't permanent. Emotional storms don't need to be solved. They need to be witnessed. And that witnessing begins the moment you choose non-reaction. Non-reaction isn't numbness. It's not pretending you're fine. It's staying grounded while the chaos moves through. It's knowing with every part of your being that this feeling will pass if you don't chase it or feed it. That clarity comes not from fighting storms, but from learning how to stand in them without being blown away. When the mind becomes turbulent, the temptation is always to react, to fix, to run, to analyze, to escape. But what if none of that was necessary? What if the reaction is what keeps the storm alive? Every time you panic in fear, resist sadness, or lash out in anger, you extend the life of the storm. You keep the system spinning. Non-reaction cuts that fuel source. One of the first steps to practicing non-reaction is recognizing the physical signals. The moment you feel the body tighten, the chest get heavy, the breath shorten, that's your cue. That's the signal that the weather is changing inside. And rather than jumping into the thought, you turn inward. You meet the feeling with breath, with space, with awareness. You may feel the urge to fix something, to say something, to act. That urge is the storm's momentum, trying to drag you with it. But you pause, you breathe, you remind yourself, this is just weather. And in that moment of pause, the storm starts to lose its power. Thought storms can be intense. They can come with memories, fears, guilt, or anger. They don't need permission, but they do need participation to stay. The less you participate, the quicker they move on. This isn't about control, it's about relationship. You stop relating to every thought as a problem to solve. You start relating to it as a cloud in motion. Non-reaction also means letting go of the need to label every emotion. Sometimes you don't even know what the storm is about. You just feel overwhelmed, and the mind will scramble to find a reason. It will create stories, dig up past failures, forecast future disasters, just to make sense of the storm. But those stories aren't always true. They're just the mind's attempt to create meaning where there may be none. The storm can simply be felt. It doesn't always need a name. In these moments, stillness becomes your power. The more you practice sitting through difficult emotions without acting on them, the more stable your inner world becomes. You realize that you can feel sadness without collapsing. You can feel fear without running. You can feel anger without harming. And that changes everything. Because now you're not ruled by weather. You're aware of it. This awareness makes you strong, not in the way the world defines strength, but in the way that matters most. The kind of strength that doesn't break when the winds rise. The kind of strength that can hold pain without needing to turn it into blame. The kind of strength that can wait for the sun to return, knowing it always does. Non-reaction is not suppression, it's permission. It says, the storm can be here, and I can still be at peace. I can still sit. I can still breathe. I can still choose. This is how you become the calm inside the chaos. Not because the storm is gone, but because you've stopped believing it defines you. Buddhist practice supports this through mindfulness meditation. You sit, you watch. The mind kicks up thoughts, stories, feelings, some pleasant, some painful. And your task is not to follow, not to fix, just to observe, to feel the rain without needing to stop it, to let the wind howl without needing to respond. At first, this feels impossible. The storm will feel too loud, too personal. But over time, you begin to notice something subtle. You're still here, even when it storms, even when the mind screams, even when your body shakes, you're still here. That's the awareness behind the weather. That's the part of you that doesn't come and go. And once you know that part, once you feel its presence, you stop fearing the mind. You stop being pulled into every surge of thought. The storm loses its grip, not because it's weak, but because you're anchored now. Anchoring practices help. Grounding in sensation, placing attention on the breath, feeling your feet, naming what you hear. These are not distractions, they're lifelines. They connect you to now, and now is where the storm loses its story. Because storms are time travelers. They drag in old wounds. They predict disasters. They spin webs across past and future. But the present is simple. The present is a breath, a heartbeat, a moment. And in that moment, you are free. Not because the storm isn't there, but because you're not inside it anymore. The mind may still storm. It's natural. No one escapes weather. But now, you know the sky isn't broken just because it's cloudy. You know the body isn't damaged just because it trembles. You know the soul isn't lost just because the mind forgets. That's the gift of non-reaction. It brings you back to what's steady. And in this steadiness, something else opens. Space. Space to respond from clarity instead of fear. Space to rest without guilt. Space to see what's actually true beneath the noise. That space is always available. You don't earn it. You remember it. You return to it every time you stop reacting. So when the next thought storm rises, when the voice in your head says it's all too much, when the tension builds, when the spiral begins, you pause, you soften, you breathe, you remember, this is weather. I am not this storm. I can stay, I can watch, I can wait, and I can let it pass without becoming it. That's what it means to be free inside your own mind. After learning to stay steady during internal storms, after practicing non-reaction when the winds of thought and emotion blow hard, you start to notice something deeper beneath the surface, something quieter, something that doesn't move with the mind, doesn't shift with your moods, and doesn't disappear in difficulty. It's what remains when everything else has passed, and the only place you can meet it is in silence. But not the kind of silence that means nothing is happening. The silence we're talking about here is active, alive. It's a silence so still it becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, something incredible happens. You start seeing what's real and what never was. All your life, you've been hearing voices, thoughts, emotions, opinions from others, stories you repeat to yourself, all of them forming who you think you are. But none of them stay. None of them are constant. And yet, there's a part of you that sees it all, a part that never changes, that watches without judgment, that holds everything without clinging to anything. That's the true self, and silence is the only way to see it clearly. Buddhist meditation isn't about becoming blank, it's about becoming honest. The moment you stop reacting to every inner noise, you start hearing what's underneath. And what's underneath is rarely chaos. It's clarity. But the reason most people never find it is because they never sit still long enough to see what's behind their mind's noise. Silence, when practiced fully, begins to reveal. It doesn't just quiet your thoughts, it reflects them. It shows you how quickly they come and go, how much of your suffering is tied to things that don't even last. And as you sit in this awareness, you begin to see through your attachments, through your identities, through your inner dialogues, not with the eyes of judgment, but with the clarity of presence. This kind of silence isn't forced. It's invited. It comes when the mind stops reaching, when it no longer tries to fix, compare, or achieve. And once it's here, you realize how much effort you've been spending just trying to be someone, holding up images, maintaining masks, running stories. All of it gets loud when you're reacting, but in silence, it all falls away. And what remains doesn't need defending. It just is. That's the power of non-reactivity. It cleans the mirror. It stops the smudging of constant analysis. It ends the fog of overthinking. And in that clean reflection, you meet the awareness that has always been there. Watching your thoughts, feeling your emotions, experiencing your life, but never changing. That awareness isn't your personality. It's not your memory. It's not your plans or preferences. It's the space all of that happens in. And when you realize you are that space, everything softens. Many people believe they need to add something to find themselves, more achievement, more insight, more meaning. But Buddhism flips that. It says, what if the truth is already here and you're just too distracted to see it? What if the answer is subtraction, not addition? What if silence isn't emptiness, but the full presence you've been searching for in all the noise? Non-reactivity makes this possible because it breaks the cycle of inner argument. It stops you from getting pulled into every thought, every identity, every opinion. And once you stop clinging to every idea of who you are, the real you, the one who doesn't need defining, starts to emerge, not in words, but in presence, in stillness, in peace that isn't connected to outcome. The more you sit in this kind of silence, the more you notice how much of your mental suffering came from chasing things that don't hold up. The approval of others, the stories from the past, the image of success, the fear of failure. All of it seemed important until you saw it fade in the mirror. And once it fades, something shifts permanently. You stop building your life around illusions. This doesn't mean you stop feeling. You still have emotions. You still have preferences. But now they move through a clearer space, a mind that reflects instead of reacts, a heart that opens instead of defends, and that openness lets you feel more deeply, not less, because you're no longer afraid that a feeling will define you forever. You know it will pass, just like everything else does. The true self revealed in silence is not a fixed version of you. It's not another identity to hold. It's the witness of all identities, the one who can be present with happiness without clinging to it, the one who can be present with sadness without fearing it, the one who can hold contradiction without needing to solve it. This is not detachment in the cold sense. It's intimacy without ownership. In this state, you also stop comparing, because silence doesn't measure, it doesn't compete. It just shows you what's here, and what's here is enough. The constant feeling of not being good enough, the one that drives people to prove, to earn, to fix, starts to dissolve, because you've seen that the deepest part of you never needed improving. It only needed to be remembered. Buddhist practice encourages this through meditation techniques that point you back to awareness again and again. When thoughts arise, you watch. When emotions swell, you watch. When stories form, you watch. Not with indifference, but with kindness. And every time you do, you realize you're not the story, you're not the emotion, you're not even the watcher, you're the watching, the space where all things appear and disappear. And once you start living from this space, not just visiting it, you stop being shaken by every wave. You stop thinking peace means nothing changes. You start knowing peace as the ability to be with change, without resistance, without hiding, without pretending. And that's where silence stops being something you practice and starts becoming who you are. Even in the middle of a busy day, this silence can stay with you. It doesn't mean no thoughts. It means no ownership of thoughts. It doesn't mean no emotion. It means no identity built from emotion. It means carrying stillness into motion, presence into interaction, awareness into every corner of your life. That's why this practice is not about isolation. It's about returning to your center again and again until even the most chaotic moments can't take it from you. Because it's not something external, it's not fragile, it's not conditional, it's the deepest part of your being, and once you've touched it, you can't unsee it. The mirror of silence will continue to reflect. Some days it shows joy, other days pain. But you stop reacting to the reflection as if it's final. You start seeing the passing of experience as part of the beauty. You no longer try to fix the mirror, you just keep it clean. And keeping it clean means staying with yourself. Being honest with what's arising. Not adding more noise, more stories, more identity. This clarity changes how you relate to others too. You start hearing their pain beneath their words. You stop reacting to their moods. You start sensing the silence in them, even when they can't feel it for themselves. And when that happens, your presence becomes healing. Not because you're trying to fix anyone, but because you've stopped needing to fix yourself. There's a line from the Zen tradition: when the mind is quiet, the true self speaks. But it doesn't speak in words, it speaks in peace, in groundedness, in stillness. That's the voice beneath all voices. And you find it not by listening harder, but by listening with nothing in the way. So the next time you sit in silence, when the thoughts start to slow and the reactions fall away, let the stillness show you something. Let it reflect what's real. Not the labels, not the shame, not the masks, but the part of you that's always been here, that never left, that never needed fixing, only seeing. Once the silence begins to reflect what's real, once you start seeing yourself clearly beneath the waves of thought, a new kind of shift begins to happen. And it's not just about stillness anymore. It's about freedom from the mental agreements you didn't even realize you made. Because as the stories start fading in the mirror, a question rises from underneath them all. Who agreed to live this way? Who said this identity was final? Who decided this version of you was all there could be? The answer for most people is no one. It just happened. A slow accumulation of thoughts, repeated beliefs, labels picked up along the way. And over time, without noticing, you began to identify with them. You turned passing thoughts into permanent roles. You formed agreements with inner narratives that sounded like facts. But in Buddhism, this is where the path of renunciation begins, not by shaving your head or leaving the world, but by letting go of the internal identities that were never truly yours. Thoughts gain power through belief. The thought itself is just a shape, just noise. But once you say, "That's me," everything changes. It becomes more than an idea, it becomes a self. And when you do that enough times, you start living from the belief instead of from awareness. You say things like, "I'm anxious," "I'm broken," "I'm not lovable," as if those are your essence. But they're not. They're borrowed stories, inherited voices, rehearsed scripts. And Buddhist renunciation isn't about becoming someone new. It's about releasing the false agreements so who you've always been can finally breathe. This process starts with awareness, like everything on this path. You begin to notice the moment a thought arises and tries to define you. You always fail. No one understands you. You don't belong. Pause there. Don't resist it. Don't believe it. Just see it. See it for what it is, a mental habit, a well-practiced loop. And in that seeing, you have your first opening. Because when you stop agreeing, the thought stops being law. The key is realizing that you don't need to fight the narrative. You don't need to rewrite it. You only need to stop feeding it. Every time you believe it, you reinforce it. Every time you question it, you loosen its grip. Not with aggression, with calm attention, with silence that doesn't try to fix, but sees clearly. In Buddhism, the concept of non-self doesn't mean you don't exist. It means that what you take to be you is not fixed. It's not a solid structure. It's a constantly shifting collection of tendencies, preferences, memories, and thoughts. When you realize this, identity becomes fluid. You're not stuck in one shape. You're not bound by past versions. And this is the true renunciation, not rejection of self, but release of attachment to false self-concepts. The thoughts you've believed for years often came from places you didn't choose. A parent's criticism, a teacher's judgment, a culture's expectations. But once they repeated enough times in your mind, you started owning them. And that's when the suffering deepened, not because the thoughts were true, but because they became personal. This is what makes inner narratives so sticky. They feel familiar, and familiarity creates comfort even when the story hurts. I'm always anxious feels stable even if it's painful. I'll never change feels known even if it's not true. Renunciation is the courage to say, I don't need this story anymore, even if I don't know what comes next, even if I feel lost without it. I choose to let it go. Letting go doesn't mean pretending the story never happened. It means you no longer let it define what's possible now. You honor your past, but you don't live in its shadow. You acknowledge the pain, but you stop building your future around it. This is the hardest part, because when you drop the identity, you also drop the certainty. But in that space, something alive begins to grow. The Buddhist path teaches that liberation doesn't come from improvement. It comes from release, from seeing that the me you've been trying to fix isn't something you need to hold on to. When you stop reinforcing that false center, what remains isn't emptiness, it's spaciousness. You feel lighter, quieter, more honest, not because you've become someone new, but because you've returned to what was never broken. One practice that helps here is labeling the thought as a narrative, not a fact. When you hear the inner voice say, I can't handle this, pause. Ask yourself, who said that first? Where did it come from? And what happens if I don't believe it today? This questioning isn't analysis, it's gentle separation. It allows you to see the thought arise, recognize its origin, and decline the invitation to believe it again. Another practice is watching how quickly thoughts try to return to identity. Even during meditation, you might feel peaceful for a moment, and then a voice says, "But this won't last." That's the narrative trying to reassert itself. You can't really change. You're faking this peace. These are the final layers of the story, and when you meet them with awareness instead of reaction, you break the agreement. Because that's what each belief is, an agreement, a handshake between thought and identity. And when you withdraw your hand, the connection ends. The thought floats by, the feeling fades, and suddenly you're not who you thought you were. You're free to respond instead of repeat. This freedom opens up in every part of life. You stop needing to prove things to people who don't see you. You stop repeating arguments in your head just to feel right. You stop holding on to versions of yourself that made sense a decade ago, but don't fit anymore. You begin to speak more honestly. You begin to walk more lightly. You stop dragging around the weight of who you were supposed to be. And people will notice. They may ask, what changed? Why you seem calmer? Why you don't get pulled into the same drama? The answer isn't a secret. It's just this. You stopped agreeing with the stories that were never really yours. This doesn't mean life becomes perfect. Thoughts still arise, voices still speak, but now you see them as passing weather, not permanent identity. You don't resist them, you don't obey them, you just let them come, let them go, and stay centered in the awareness that doesn't need to be anything other than present. That's the gift of Buddhist renunciation. It doesn't take away your personality. It removes the mask you didn't know you were wearing. The one built from fear, from shame, from survival. And once it's gone, what's left is something softer, more open, more real. There's a teaching in the Buddhist texts that says, just as a snake sheds its skin, so must the mind shed its past selves. Not to be empty, but to be new, to be free, to stop mistaking old thoughts for current truth. So when a thought arises that tries to define you, when the mind says, this is who you are, pause, breathe, and ask, who would I be without this story? What opens up when I stop believing this voice? What freedom becomes possible when I stop holding on to who I've been? Let those questions hang in the stillness. So once the inner stories begin to loosen, once those invisible agreements are broken and the old identities lose their hold, something strange tends to show up in their place. Not peace right away, not joy, but doubt. And that's where many people hesitate. Because doubt is uncomfortable. It makes you question what's real. It shakes the ground that once felt certain. But in Buddhism, this moment isn't a problem. It's a path. Doubt, when approached with awareness, becomes one of the most powerful teachers on the journey. Doubt has a reputation as an obstacle, a signal that something's wrong, a sign that you're off track. But that's only because of how it's usually handled, with fear, resistance, and shame. Buddhist practice teaches something radically different. It invites you to step closer to doubt, to get curious about it, and to see it not as a stop sign, but as a door. Doubt, when met with mindfulness, doesn't close you down, it opens you up. The first thing to understand is that doubt appears in two forms. There's paralyzing doubt and there's probing doubt. The first kind says, you can't do this. This isn't working. You're wasting your time. It's reactive, looping, full of confusion. But the second kind asks real questions. It's sincere. It wonders, what's really true here? Is this belief helping or hurting? What am I missing? That kind of doubt isn't poison. It's a spark. It means your mind is waking up. It means you're beginning to think for yourself. In Buddhist teachings, doubt is one of the 5 hindrances, not because it's inherently bad, but because it can freeze the path if it's misunderstood. When doubt becomes constant second-guessing or a mental fog that stops you from practicing, it's a problem. But when it becomes a tool for deeper investigation, it becomes fuel. The goal isn't to eliminate doubt, it's to meet it in a new way. One of the most common sources of doubt is progress itself. You begin to let go of your old narratives. You stop identifying with every thought, and suddenly things feel unfamiliar, quiet, open, and doubt creeps in. Is this real growth, or am I just lost? Is this insight, or am I fooling myself? These are normal questions, but they only become suffering when you avoid them. Buddhist mindfulness says, turn toward the doubt, sit with it. Don't rush for answers. Let the question breathe. This approach transforms the entire experience, because now, instead of running from discomfort, you're using it. You're listening to it. And that listening reveals layers you never saw before. Often, doubt covers deeper fears. Fear of change, fear of letting go, fear of being wrong. When you pause and stay with doubt, those fears start to show themselves, and once seen, they lose their grip. There's also a beautiful teaching in Buddhism that says, doubt only arises in minds that are trying to wake up. A dull mind doesn't doubt. It repeats. But the moment you begin to question what you've been told, what you've believed, how you've been living, that's not weakness. That's awareness trying to deepen. It means the old autopilot isn't good enough anymore. This is especially true with spiritual practice. When you begin meditating or working with mindfulness, the mind will often push back. This is pointless. I'm not doing it right. Nothing is happening. These doubts are signs that you're entering a new space, one where thought can't control everything anymore. And thought doesn't like that. So it pushes doubt like a defense mechanism, not because you're failing, but because something deeper is being revealed. Here's where practice matters. The moment doubt arises, the instinct is to analyze, to go back into the head, trying to solve the doubt with more thought. But the invitation is to feel it instead. Let it sit in the body. Notice the tone of it. Is it heavy? Is it sharp? Is it dull? This moves you out of thinking and into sensing, and sensing reveals more truth than spiraling ever could. What you'll find is that doubt often has a rhythm. It starts with a trigger, a difficult moment, a pause in progress, a strong emotion. Then comes the thought, this isn't working. Then the body tenses. Then the spiral begins. Recognizing this sequence allows you to break it. You pause earlier. You see the thought not as fact, but as habit. You stay present instead of escaping into mental loops. That's where the transformation happens. Buddhism encourages this through inquiry practices. You don't just accept every thought. You ask, is this helpful? Is this kind? Is this true right now? Not with judgment, with curiosity. And that curiosity turns doubt into insight. It becomes the very thing that sharpens your awareness. Some of the greatest spiritual insights come through the doorway of doubt. You question something you were taught. You examine a belief you've carried for years. You realize it was never yours. Or maybe it was useful once, but now it holds you back. Doubt helped you see that. And by releasing what's no longer true, you make space for what is. Another way doubt becomes a teacher is by building resilience. If you can stay present with not knowing, if you can sit in the space between answers, you develop a quiet strength, a capacity to wait, to trust, to not collapse the question too soon. That's rare. Most people rush to fill the silence, but spiritual depth lives in that silence, and doubt teaches you how to live there. This doesn't mean you ignore all questioning. It means you stop treating questions like problems. You stop demanding instant resolution. You let doubt become a mirror, not a wall. A place to see more clearly, not a reason to shut down. And the more you practice this, the more your mind begins to trust the process. You start realizing, just because something feels uncertain doesn't mean it's wrong. It might mean it's real. You'll also notice that when you stop reacting to doubt, it often fades on its own. You don't need to answer it. You just need to not feed it. Doubt thrives on resistance, on fear, on the need to be certain. But when you meet it with patience, it begins to shift. It softens. And in that softening, insight appears, a deeper knowing, one that doesn't come from intellect, but from presence. This presence changes how you live. You stop needing constant reassurance. You stop looking for perfect clarity before taking a step. You begin moving through life with more trust, not because you know everything, but because you're okay not knowing everything. That's what real clarity feels like. Not perfect answers, but peaceful openness. And sometimes doubt will return just when you think you've outgrown it. It might show up when you try something new, when you step out of an old identity, when you begin to speak or live more authentically. It shows up to ask, "Are you sure?" But now you don't panic. You say, "I don't need to be sure, I just need to stay present." And that response dissolves the fear behind the doubt. There's a story in the Buddhist tradition where even the Buddha himself faced Mara, the voice of doubt, again and again. Not just before enlightenment, but even afterward. And every time Mara came, the Buddha didn't fight. He didn't run. He said, "I see you, Mara. Come, let's have tea." That's the practice. Recognition without reaction. Presence without fear. So when doubt shows up in your own path, when your mind says, "This can't be right," or "You're not ready," or "This won't work," pause. Let the voice be heard, but don't bow to it. Don't run from it either. Just breathe, stay curious, and remember, this isn't the end of the path. This is the path. After learning how to work with doubt, not as a threat, but as a doorway into deeper truth, something even more subtle begins to rise to the surface. You start to realize that not all your thoughts even feel like yours. Some of them don't come from your own direct experience. They carry a different tone, a different pressure, a different kind of heaviness. And if you look closely, you'll notice something unsettling yet liberating. Some thoughts were never yours to begin with. They were implanted, passed down, inherited without permission, and now they're being exposed. Buddhism teaches that not all suffering comes from personal failure. Much of it comes from unconscious absorption. The mind doesn't exist in isolation. It absorbs from the environment, from family, school, religion, media, culture. It forms beliefs long before it knows how to question them. And those beliefs, once internalized, shape thought patterns so deeply that they become mistaken for truth. This is the trap of foreign constructs. They enter subtly through repetition. A child hears, "Don't be too loud. You should be more helpful. You always make things difficult." Those words repeat, they echo, and eventually they become internal rules. But whose rules are they? Where did they come from? Who benefited from them? And who would you be without them? These are the questions Buddhist self-inquiry encourages you to ask, not to judge your past, but to free you from it. Because the first step to healing a mind filled with borrowed narratives is recognizing they were borrowed. You didn't consent to them, you didn't write them, and you don't have to keep living by them. One of the clearest signs of a foreign thought is how automatic it feels. It doesn't come from reflection, it's just there. Quick, loud, unquestioned, and often it comes with shame. I should have done more. I'll never be good enough. People will judge me. These aren't truths, they're scripts. And the moment you start observing them, instead of obeying them, the script starts to fall apart. This isn't about blame, it's about clarity. No one goes through life without absorbing something from the outside world. Cultural standards, gender roles, success formulas, spiritual dogmas, they all sneak in over time. But the Buddhist path is about direct experience, not hand-me-down beliefs, not borrowed guilt, not societal expectations you were never meant to carry. It's about looking at each thought and asking, is this mine, or is this someone else's voice in disguise? You'll notice these constructs don't just affect your self-image. They influence your decisions, your relationships, your behavior when no one's watching. That's how deeply they're embedded. And until they're seen clearly, they keep running your life like invisible strings. A common example is productivity. The idea that you are only valuable when you're busy, when you're achieving, when you're proving. This thought runs through modern society like electricity. But it's not truth. It's culture. A culture that fears stillness, that monetizes exhaustion, that celebrates burnout as dedication. If you've absorbed that, then every time you rest, guilt will show up. Not because rest is wrong, but because the thought that governs your worth is foreign. Another example is emotional suppression. Many people are taught not to cry, not to show fear, not to express anger. These aren't spiritual insights, they're cultural controls, designed to shape behavior, not to free the mind. And once internalized, they become the inner critic. They speak in shoulds. You should be stronger. You shouldn't feel this way. But who decided that? Where did that voice come from? And how long are you going to keep believing it? When you sit in meditation long enough, these patterns start to reveal themselves. They lose their invisibility. You notice how they speak, how they twist, how they replay in the same way. And something inside you finally says, "This doesn't feel like me." That's the beginning of release. But release takes courage, because sometimes these foreign thoughts are tied to people you loved, parents, teachers, communities. Letting go of the thought can feel like disloyalty. But it's not betrayal, it's clarity. You're not rejecting anyone. You're reclaiming the right to think freely, to feel honestly, to live from presence instead of programming. Buddhist teachings use mindfulness not just to quiet the mind, but to clean it, to filter out what doesn't belong, to catch the thought before it becomes identity. And one of the most powerful tools in this process is gentle questioning, not harsh interrogation, just simple, steady curiosity. Who told me this? Do I know it's true? Does this thought bring peace or pain? The answers don't come all at once, but they come, and with them comes freedom. You'll also notice that these foreign constructs often conflict with each other. One voice says, "Speak up." Another says, "Stay quiet." One says, "Be independent." Another says, Don't upset anyone. These contradictions are signs that the thoughts were layered from different places, and the confusion isn't your fault. It's the natural result of absorbing too many rules without sorting them. The work is to untangle the threads, not to become thoughtless, but to become choiceful, aware, present. You may keep some of those ideas. You may discard others. The point is not to empty your mind. It's to make sure it's your mind, not a museum of other people's expectations. This clarity shifts everything. Relationships become more honest. Work becomes more aligned. You stop trying to please ghosts. You stop reacting to imaginary judgment. You stop holding yourself to silent standards you never agreed to. And in that space, a more natural self begins to emerge. Not perfect, not polished, just real. And real is enough. You might notice these foreign thoughts show up strongest in moments of vulnerability. When you fail, when you rest, when you express emotion. That's when the voice says, "See? You're weak." But now you hear it clearly, and you answer it with presence. Not argument, just quiet awareness. You let the thought come. You see it. You don't obey, and you let it go. This doesn't mean you won't struggle. Some thoughts are deeply embedded, but every time you question them, every time you choose not to believe, you break the illusion a little more. You return to yourself a little more, and with time, the thoughts show up less. The silence stays longer. The clarity deepens. You begin to live more from direct experience, less from programming. You don't need a script to know who you are. You stop asking, "What should I do?" and start asking, "What's true right now?" That's the shift from borrowed identity to embodied presence, from social echo to inner knowing. So when the next thought arises that makes you feel small, unworthy, or afraid, pause, listen, ask, "Is this my voice, or is this someone else's belief trying to wear my face?" And if it doesn't belong, let it go, not with force, with clarity, with compassion, with the quiet strength that comes from finally living in your own mind. Now that you've learned to recognize the thoughts that never belong to you, the ones shaped by culture, expectation, and inheritance, another question quietly starts to rise beneath the surface. If those weren't your true thoughts, then what is driving your inner world? What's fueling the restlessness, the pressure, the negativity that keeps resurfacing even in silence? The answer lies deeper than most people are willing to go. Because beneath all the noise sits something small, quiet, and powerful, a seed. And in Buddhism, that seed is craving. Most of the negativity you experience doesn't start with a thought. It starts with desire. Not always the loud kind, the craving for money, status, or validation, but the subtle kind, the kind that hides, the kind you barely notice, a wish for things to be different, a need for people to see you a certain way, an ache to finally feel at peace. These are the invisible seeds. They don't shout, they whisper, and over time they shape the way your mind moves. This is one of the deepest insights in Buddhist psychology, that negative thinking often grows not from life's events, but from the tension between how life is and how you secretly wish it would be. Every unexamined desire creates a quiet resistance. And that resistance turns into emotion, into judgment, into stress. Not because something's wrong, but because something inside you is holding on. The mind isn't wrong for desiring. It's wired that way. It wants what feels good. It avoids what feels bad. But when you don't see that clearly, when you aren't aware of what's driving your thoughts, you start blaming the surface. You think the problem is your boss, or your body, or your past. But often, the real source is the desire beneath it, the invisible wanting that says, things should be different than they are. And that small sentence, when left unexamined, becomes a lifetime of struggle. There's nothing wrong with wanting. That's not the message here. But Buddhism points to a specific kind of desire, the clinging kind, the desire that doesn't just hope, but attaches, that says, I need this to be happy. That's the root of suffering, because the moment your peace depends on something outside of you, you've handed away your freedom. This craving often hides in plain sight. You feel irritated, but you don't know why. You feel tense, but there's no crisis. You feel envious, but don't admit it. And when you trace it back, you find a quiet expectation. I should be further along. They should treat me better. Life should feel easier. These are not just complaints, they are seeds, and until they are seen clearly, they will keep growing into thought patterns that sabotage your inner peace. Meditation is where these patterns start to reveal themselves. You sit, you breathe, you try to rest, and then discomfort rises. Boredom, agitation, the mind wants to escape, and if you look closer, you find the seed, the desire to feel a certain way, the wish for peace right now. And when it doesn't happen, negativity takes its place. This is how craving works. It promises relief, but when unmet, it poisons the present. What makes this so tricky is that most of these desires are unconscious. You don't wake up thinking, today I want to be admired, but the moment you're ignored, something inside tightens. That's how you know the desire was there all along. The suffering reveals the seed, and Buddhist awareness helps you go beneath the reaction to find what was planted. This awareness doesn't judge the desire, it just sees it. And in that seeing, something loosens. You realize that wanting approval is human, but attaching your worth to it is suffering. You see that wishing for love is natural, but expecting it to arrive in one specific way creates pain. You notice that hoping for comfort is okay, but believing you must be comfortable all the time traps you. One of the most powerful ways to uncover hidden desires is to watch your reactions. Every time you feel frustration, ask, what was I hoping for? When jealousy arises, ask, what do I feel I'm missing? When sadness lingers, ask, what part of life am I refusing to accept? These questions aren't meant to shame you. They're meant to reveal the invisible seeds, because only when you see them clearly can you stop feeding them. There's also a truth most people avoid. Not all desires are worth keeping. Some were planted by insecurity, others by marketing, others by unresolved pain. Just because something feels like it's yours doesn't mean it belongs in your life. Buddhist renunciation isn't about giving up joy. It's about releasing the cravings that steal joy by convincing you you're not enough without them. This clarity can be uncomfortable because it forces you to admit how much energy has been spent chasing what never needed to be chased. But that discomfort is also freedom. It means You're waking up. You're no longer letting invisible cravings shape your thoughts, your emotions, your sense of self. Sometimes the desire is subtle, the need to be understood, to be seen, to be respected. These seem harmless, but if they become conditions for your peace, they'll trap you, because no one can guarantee you'll be understood, or praised, or validated. And when those moments don't come, negativity rises, not because life is cruel, but because a quiet attachment wasn't met. The goal isn't to stop feeling, it's to stop building your identity around unmet needs. You start practicing presence not just with your thoughts, but with the cravings underneath them. You say, "I see you, desire. I understand why you're here, but I don't need to follow you." And that sentence can change your entire relationship with your mind. There's a story in the Buddhist tradition about a monk who couldn't find peace in meditation. Every time he sat, he felt frustrated, tense, distracted. He told his teacher, "I can't find stillness." The teacher asked, "What are you looking for?" The monk said, "Enlightenment." The teacher smiled and said, "Then that's your problem." Because even the desire for peace can become a block to peace. Even spiritual craving, if clung to, becomes suffering. This lesson applies everywhere. The desire to be right can create conflict. The desire to win can create fear. The desire to never feel pain can create numbness. When you trace each of these back, they all start with a simple hope, harmless on the surface. But they grow into demands, and those demands turn into thought loops, emotional spirals, and mental suffering. Buddhist wisdom says, uproot the craving, and the thought loses its power. Not by suppression, not by force, but by recognition, by presence. The craving says, "You need this." Awareness replies, "Do I?" That gap between impulse and response, that's where freedom lives. The more you practice this, the more space opens inside. You start to notice when thoughts are fueled by want, when emotion is stirred by expectation, and instead of being pulled into the storm, you remain still. Not because you've stopped desiring anything, but because you've stopped letting desire rule you. You might still work toward goals, still pursue dreams, but now you're not bound by them. You can hold them lightly. You can let them go when they're no longer aligned. Because you've seen that true peace isn't something to chase. It's what returns when craving isn't in control. So next time your thoughts start to turn dark, heavy, loud, pause. Ask what desire is hiding underneath. Is it a wish for control, for safety, for attention? Look at it, feel it, and then breathe. You don't need to silence the desire. You just need to stop believing it's the source of happiness. Because the real source, the one that never leaves, is awareness. Still, whole, enough. Once the invisible cravings begin to show, once you recognize how quietly they fuel your thoughts, how softly they twist your peace, it becomes clear that something deeper is needed. Not just awareness, not just curiosity, but steadiness. A mind strong enough to hold the waves without crashing. A presence stable enough to remain whole even when inner fires rise. This is where samatha enters the path. A practice not for escaping thought, but for grounding it, for calming the volcano at the center of your being until silence becomes natural. Samatha means tranquility, but not the passive kind. It's a cultivated stillness, one that comes from training the mind to rest on one object so fully that all mental noise begins to fade. Not because it's been pushed away, but because the mind no longer feeds it. When practiced with patience, samatha doesn't just reduce negativity. It creates the kind of inner calm that makes negative thoughts irrelevant. The practice begins with a simple focus, often the breath. Not because the breath is magical, but because it's constant. It's always here, always moving, always inviting you back. And as you return to it again and again, something in you begins to shift. You start to notice the space between distractions, the pauses between thoughts, and slowly those spaces grow. But samatha is not about stopping thought. It's about stopping scattering. The mind, left untrained, jumps from one thing to another endlessly. It's pulled by memory, by craving, by fear, by noise. And every pull adds fuel to the emotional fire. Samatha interrupts that. It teaches the mind to settle, to stay, to anchor itself so deeply that even when a storm rises, you don't lose your center. At first, the mind resists. It doesn't want to sit still. It wants stimulation, movement, noise, and the practice becomes a gentle, repeated redirection. Thought comes, you return to the breath. Restlessness arises, you return to the breath. Boredom surfaces, you return. Each return is a training, not punishment, not failure, just practice. And that repetition builds strength. As concentration deepens, a few things begin to change. First, the volume of thought begins to drop, not because you've forced it quiet, but because the mind is no longer scattered across 100 things. Attention, when unified, becomes like water collected in one place. It deepens, and when the mind deepens, its surface grows calm. This calm isn't fragile. It doesn't depend on perfect conditions. It's a quiet you carry with you, even in noise, even in challenge. Because the mind has learned how to rest, how to center itself, how to return to the breath, not just in meditation, but in life. The second change is clarity. As the mind quiets, your awareness sharpens. You begin to see thoughts before they fully form. You catch irritation in the chest before it becomes anger. You notice fear as sensation, not story. This awareness becomes your shield, not a wall, but a lens. You see clearly without being overwhelmed. You meet emotion without drowning in it. And then there's the most profound change. You start to experience peace without needing reason, not because something external happened, not because a problem got solved, but because the mind, trained and still, reveals its natural state. That state isn't chaos. It's calm. Chaos comes from agitation. Calm comes from resting deeply. And samatha is the path to that resting. But this isn't a shortcut. It's not flashy. It requires patience, discipline, a willingness to return again and again. And yet, it's simple. You're not trying to achieve anything. You're just practicing presence with the breath, with sensation, with this moment. No expectation, no goal, just the repeated act of stillness. Over time, this practice doesn't just quiet the mind, it transforms your relationship with yourself. The negative thoughts that used to feel overwhelming now seem distant. The emotional spirals lose momentum. You begin to respond instead of react. You begin to live from a deeper place, not because you've changed everything, but because you've anchored yourself below the noise. This anchoring is what calms the inner volcano. That place inside that erupts with fear, with judgment, with doubt. Samatha doesn't silence the volcano by suppression. It cools it by creating space, by lowering heat through presence. Each breath is like water poured into the fire, not aggressively, just consistently. And over time, the fire softens. The eruptions become fewer. The heat turns to warmth. The ground becomes stable. What's beautiful about samatha is that it asks nothing extraordinary of you. No special beliefs, no rituals, just attention, just returning, just choosing again and again to stay. And in that staying, the most extraordinary change begins. You realize you don't need to escape your mind to find peace. You just need to train it to rest. This practice also travels with you. It moves from the cushion into your day. You're at work and the stress rises. Return to breath. You're in conflict and the heart races. Return. You're alone and old thoughts come knocking. Return. Each moment becomes a chance to choose calm over chaos, to stay when the mind wants to run, to soften when the world gets loud. And what grows from that is trust. Not just in the practice, but in yourself. You begin to trust your own awareness, your own ability to hold discomfort, to stay through difficulty, to return to calm not as a reaction, but as a choice. That's what changes everything. Because when peace is a choice, negativity loses its control. There's a saying in the Buddhist texts, "The mind, once tamed, brings happiness greater than any external pleasure." This isn't poetic exaggeration, it's direct experience. A mind that knows how to rest, how to focus, how to remain still in storm. This mind becomes a sanctuary, not because it's empty, but because it's free. So, tonight, if the mind feels wild, if thoughts feel heavy, if your emotions begin to flare, don't run, don't chase them, don't fight, just breathe. Just return. One inhale, one exhale. Let the fire burn if it must. You don't need to stop it. You just need to sit beside it. And with time, the fire will quiet, not because you controlled it, but because you stopped feeding it. That's the heart of samatha. Concentration that doesn't resist life, but reshapes how the mind moves through it. So once the mind has been calmed through samatha, once you've felt the stillness grow strong enough to hold even your most intense emotions, something unexpected may happen. A thought slips through the silence, something sharp or uninvited, and almost instantly the instinct returns. Fix it, analyze it, replace it, solve it. It's a reflex so familiar that it feels natural. But in the Buddhist path, this is exactly where the deeper trap begins. Because sometimes the very effort to fix the mind is what keeps it from being free. There's a difference between awareness and intervention. Awareness sees. Intervention judges. Awareness observes. Intervention interferes. And when thought arises, especially if it's negative or confusing, most people jump to strategy. I need to think a better thought. I have to stop thinking like this. How can I fix this problem in my head? The intention may seem wise, but the outcome is almost always more noise, more inner struggle, more distance from peace. The mind is clever. It can disguise fixing as self-help, as improvement, even as spiritual practice. But beneath that is the same old mechanism: resistance. A subtle rejection of what's happening right now. A quiet belief that something's wrong, that something needs to change before you can rest. And that belief, though small, creates endless suffering, because it turns the mind into a battlefield instead of a resting place. This is one of the core paradoxes of Buddhist insight, that trying to fix the mind often makes it worse. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because the very act of fixing is built on the assumption that something is broken, that the present moment is insufficient, that what's happening now shouldn't be happening, and that mindset ensures inner conflict. What the practice asks instead is this: let the thought be. Not because you agree with it, not because you're giving up, but because fixing has failed too many times. You've tried arguing with your thoughts. You've tried replacing them, reframing them, managing them, and still they come back, maybe louder, maybe sneakier, maybe dressed in new words. The mind is like water. It flows around every attempt to control it. And what it needs is not your control. It needs your surrender. Surrender doesn't mean collapse. It means giving up the fight. It means letting thought arise without building a reaction around it. Letting the emotion surface without turning it into a mission. You stop feeding the energy of "this shouldn't be here." And in that space, something softens. The thought begins to dissolve, not because you changed it, but because you stopped fueling it. There's a deeper truth underneath this. Thoughts aren't personal. They arise based on habit, memory, conditioning, biology. They don't mean something about who you are, but the moment you try to fix them, you make them personal. You turn them into identity. "I need to fix this" becomes "this thought is a problem and I am the one causing it." That's where the spiral begins. Instead of trying to fix, Buddhist practice teaches us to rest in observation. The thought appears and you note it, thinking. The emotion rises and you say, feeling. No storyline, no analysis, no judgment, just clear seeing, and the clarity itself becomes the healing. You don't need to change the content of the mind. You need to stop being controlled by it. This shift changes everything, because now even painful thoughts lose their grip. You don't need to solve them. You just watch them. They lose their urgency, their edge. They pass like clouds instead of becoming storms. And even if they stay for a while, you're no longer tense around them. That's what freedom feels like. Not the absence of thought, but the absence of struggle. There's a kind of peace that only arrives when you stop trying to create it. It shows up when the mind is no longer being pushed or pulled, and you'll know you're getting close when even the most uncomfortable thoughts feel spacious. When you can sit with them, breathe with them, and not feel the need to chase them away. That's not defeat, that's mastery. A lot of people confuse effort with progress. But on this path, the deepest progress often comes through letting go, through not interfering, through trusting that the mind, when left unagitated, begins to settle on its own. That awareness, not action, is what brings transformation. The more you try to fix the mind, the more you teach it that it's broken. But the more you let it be, the more it begins to return to its natural state, quiet, clear, and balanced. This doesn't mean you become passive. It means you become wise. You know the difference between reaction and response, between effort and presence. You learn to act when it's time to act, and to sit still when it's time to sit still. You don't need to fix every wave. You just need to remember that you are not the wave. You are the ocean. One of the reasons fixing backfires is that it adds layers to the problem. A single thought becomes a project. You start tracking it, categorizing it, building strategies around it. Soon, the thought isn't even the problem anymore. The effort to fix it is. And now you're caught in a loop of self-monitoring, always trying to optimize the mind instead of simply resting in it. This is where surrender becomes powerful. Not as a giving up, but as a tuning in. You begin to notice the subtle pressure you've been carrying to always feel better, to always think clearly, to always be free of negativity. And you see how exhausting that is, how much energy it steals. And in that moment, you exhale. You release the need to control. And suddenly, the mind begins to soften. Sometimes the thought you're trying to fix is just a passing echo. It wasn't even strong until you grabbed it, until you decided it needed your attention. But what happens when you don't grab it? When you let it float by? You see its true nature, temporary, insignificant, just noise. And the more you practice this, the more thoughts reveal themselves as nothing more than passing weather. You no longer fear them. You no longer worship them. You simply let them move. This doesn't mean thought stops, but your relationship to it changes. You no longer believe every voice. You no longer need to fix every discomfort. You become less reactive, more grounded, more real. Not because your thoughts are always pleasant, but because you've stopped treating them like they're the whole truth. Buddhist practice is filled with reminders of this. Teachers speak of watching the mind like watching a river, not jumping in, not building a dam, just observing its flow, letting it carry what it must, and returning again and again to the bank, to the breath, to the stillness beneath the surface. You don't need to change the river. You need to stop drowning in it. The mind will try to trick you. It will say, if I don't fix this thought, it will control me. But the opposite is true. If you try to fix it, you give it power. If you leave it alone, it loses shape. This is not spiritual bypassing. It's clarity. It's knowing that thoughts, left ungrasped, fade faster than you think. This practice invites patience. You won't unlearn the habit of fixing overnight, but every time you pause instead of solve, you strengthen a new pattern, a pattern of trust, of stillness, of presence. And presence doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to be consistent. So next time the thought comes, sharp, loud, urgent, try this. Do nothing. Watch it. Feel it. Let it burn if it must. But don't touch it. Don't fix it. Don't label it as wrong. And in that space, watch what happens. Often, the silence that follows says more than any solution ever could. Let the fixing end here. Let the peace begin from where you stopped trying. Let's keep going. After letting go of the urge to fix everything in your head, after finally seeing that silence doesn't come from control, but from surrender, you start noticing something else. a pattern. Certain thoughts still return. Not every day, not always strong, but often enough to feel familiar. And the question starts to grow quietly in your awareness. Why do some thoughts leave and never come back, while others keep looping like they have nowhere else to go? This is where Buddhist teaching brings forward a deeper layer of understanding: karma. Not in the way it's often misunderstood as punishment or reward, but in its true form, action and its residue. Karma doesn't just live in the outer world, it lives in the mind. Every thought, every reaction, every intention creates a subtle impression, and those impressions, if not seen clearly, return. Not because life is unfair, but because the mind repeats what it has not resolved. When you think a thought with strong emotion, whether it's fear, guilt, craving, or resistance, it leaves a mark. That mark doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It stays, quietly shaping the conditions for the same thought to reappear later. This is mental karma, not cosmic retribution, but psychological repetition. You think it once, it gets easier to think again, and if it goes unchecked, it becomes automatic. This explains why certain negative thoughts feel sticky. They're not just passing observations, they're mental grooves, worn deep over time. You don't just think them, they think themselves. You don't create them anymore. They arise from the mental climate you've lived in. They repeat because the karmic imprint hasn't been purified. And without purification, the cycle goes on. The Buddhist view is compassionate here. It doesn't blame you for your karma. It invites you to understand it, to look at it like old echoes, not evidence of failure. Repetitive thoughts aren't a sign you're broken. They're signs that your inner world is still holding on to something that wants to be seen, understood, and released. So how do you do that? Not through force, not through denial, through purification. And purification begins with awareness. You must first catch the pattern, see how it works, trace it to its source. When a thought arises, ask, when did I first start thinking this way? What memory does this pull from? What emotion is tied to it? Don't answer quickly. Sit with it. Let the deeper layers rise. You'll often find that recurring thoughts are tied to old experiences that were never fully processed. Something painful, something confusing, something that created an emotional shock but was buried to keep going. And when the mind quiets, it resurfaces, not to torment you, but to be completed, to be felt, to be honored and then released. That release doesn't come from reliving the past. It comes from meeting the imprint with full presence. You feel what wasn't felt before. You see the story without defending or blaming. You breathe through the discomfort instead of shutting it down, and with each breath, the karmic weight begins to lift. There are also specific purification practices in Buddhism designed to dissolve these imprints. One is repeated meditation with clear intention. You sit not just to calm the mind, but to purify it, to burn through the residue without reacting. Each time the thought returns, you return to stillness. You stop believing the story, and in that refusal to re-engage, the story loses power. It starts to fade. Another method is mindful confession, not in a religious sense, but as a practice of honesty. You name what's been hidden. You acknowledge the thoughts, the regrets, the memories that fuel the loop. You say inwardly, yes, this happened. Yes, I've carried this, but I don't need to carry it anymore. The act of bringing it into light begins the dissolving process. What is seen clearly no longer controls you. Compassion is also central to purification, not just for others, but for yourself. Many recurring thoughts are kept alive by self-judgment. You judge the thought, then judge yourself for having it. That double layer creates a karmic echo chamber. But when you respond to the thought with compassion, this is painful and it's okay, the judgment drops. And when judgment drops, the loop weakens. Chanting and mantra recitation are another form of purification. They focus the mind, shift the emotional tone, and generate a new mental rhythm. It's not about magical words. It's about repetition that builds new imprints, imprints of stillness, of clarity, of peace. Over time, these replace the old ones, like replacing a worn path through a field with a new one that leads somewhere better. And perhaps the most profound form of purification is forgiveness. Not always for someone else. Sometimes just for yourself. You forgive the version of you that reacted, that got lost in negativity, that didn't know better. You stop punishing yourself with repeated thought. You say, "That was then, this is now." And each time you say it, you loosen the bond between past and present. The reason this works isn't mystical. It's practical. Forgiveness changes the emotional charge. It removes the fuel that keeps the thought alive. Without guilt, without resentment, without fear, the thought has nothing to stick to. It floats, it leaves, and it doesn't need to come back. But even with all of this, some thoughts return simply because the habit is strong. And in those moments, you return to what you've already practiced: non-reaction. You don't make it personal. You don't see it as a problem. You say, this thought again, and you let it pass. Like a song on the radio you no longer need to turn off, because you know it ends. The more you do this, the more spacious the mind becomes. Not because you've silenced every thought, but because the thoughts no longer find anything to grab. The karmic residue weakens. The loops break. You become less identified with the past, less defined by old stories. You begin to think freely, not from fear, not from habit, from clarity. You'll start noticing the difference between a fresh thought and a karmic echo. Fresh thoughts feel light, responsive, aligned with the moment. Echoes feel stale, heavy, and emotionally charged. When you see that clearly, you stop treating every thought like it deserves your energy. You become more discerning. You listen, but you don't absorb. This doesn't mean you'll never feel pain again, but it means pain doesn't stay when it's not being fed. And that's what purification gives you, not perfection, but movement, flow. You stop being stuck in mental loops because you've cleared the anchors. So the next time a thought returns for the 10th, 20th, 100th time, pause. Don't resist. Don't react. Ask gently, "What haven't I seen yet?" And then sit, not with expectation, with presence. Let the imprint rise, let the emotion move, and let the thought complete itself, finally, without your interference. Because karma isn't your enemy, it's your teacher, and once the lesson is learned, the thought doesn't need to return. So after sitting with the roots of mental karma, after watching how repetitive thoughts are often held in place by old imprints, unresolved emotion, and internal resistance, there comes a quiet shift. Not everything needs to be released by force. Not every thought needs to be untangled, analyzed, or purified through pain. Sometimes a different relationship is enough. Not rejection, not agreement, just openness. This is where Buddhist wisdom offers something beautifully simple. Treat thoughts like guests. The practice is called hospitable awareness, and it means this: when a thought arises, welcome it. Not because you want it to stay, not because you believe it, but because fighting it keeps it alive, and ignoring it gives it weight. But hosting it gives it space, and in space, it naturally dissolves. This approach changes everything, because the moment you stop tightening around thought, the energy of thought changes. It loses its urgency. It stops being a threat. And even the most difficult inner voices begin to soften, not because you fix them, but because you finally let them be. Think about what happens when someone knocks on your door. If you slam the door in their face, tension rises. If you pull them in and panic, you lose your ground. But if you open the door, offer a seat, pour tea, and stay calm, something settles. The guest doesn't stay forever. They're seen, acknowledged, and eventually they leave. That's how you treat thought. Buddhist texts have long pointed to this. Thoughts are not the enemy. They are visitors. Some loud, some quiet, some beautiful, others messy, but all of them passing. The mistake is thinking they are permanent, that they must be controlled, or that they define who you are. But a guest is not the homeowner, and a thought is not the mind. Hospitable awareness is not passive. It's deeply attentive. You stay aware of what enters. You remain present, but you don't become the thought. You don't grip it, and you don't push it away. You create space without attachment, and that space is healing. The mind becomes safer when it's not treated like a battlefield. When thoughts are no longer met with fear, they lose the power to dominate. Anxiety may still visit. Doubt may come. Shame might knock on the door. But now, instead of reacting, you greet them. You say, "Ah, you're here again." You breathe, you watch, and they move on. What's beautiful about this practice is how immediate its effects can be. You may have spent years trying to change your thinking, using tools, strategies, affirmations, mantras, and yet, sometimes, the simplest gesture, just letting the thought sit beside you, creates more peace than any technique. That's because most suffering isn't caused by thought itself. It's caused by the resistance to thought. The mental tension that says, "This shouldn't be happening." But when you remove that tension, what's left is just experience. A moment, a flicker, a breath. Some thoughts return often. They feel like familiar guests who never know when to leave. But even these lose their power when hosted with equanimity. You don't need to change their message. You don't need to entertain them with attention. You simply let them be there while you remain rooted in the now. This practice is not about ignoring life. It's about meeting life with dignity. Every thought, even the unpleasant ones, becomes part of the experience, not an interruption of peace, but part of the landscape in which peace arises anyway. You may be surprised to find that once you stop fearing your thoughts, you start understanding them, not intellectually, but intuitively. You feel their emotional tone, you sense their origin, and most of all, you see how they pass on their own, without needing your intervention. This is why the metaphor of a guest is so powerful. It includes everything without clinging to anything. You don't become the thought, and you don't push it out the moment it arrives. You give it room, and by doing so, you give yourself room. Space to breathe, space to observe, space to not react. There's a quiet confidence that grows from this. You stop being thrown by every mental storm. You stop being afraid of your inner world, because now you know you can host anything. Anger, sadness, fear. None of it needs to define you. None of it can trap you, because you're the space. You're the host, not the guest. And this space becomes your refuge. Even in chaos, even in overwhelm, you can return to it. You sit, you breathe, you feel the thought rise. And instead of flinching, you say, welcome. You don't say it with affection or hate, just presence, just stillness. And that stillness is stronger than any thought. Some days, the guests will be loud, judgment will shout, memory will ache, craving will demand. But the space remains, and that space is not cold or indifferent. It's kind. It knows that every guest has their reason for arriving, even the painful ones. They're carrying a message, a need, a leftover impression. And once heard, not believed, not obeyed, just heard, they can go. You'll also start to notice the pattern. Thoughts that are resisted return stronger. Thoughts that are chased become faster. But thoughts that are welcomed lose urgency. They fade like smoke without wind, and your energy remains intact. This kind of awareness doesn't mean you become detached from life. It means you become present within it. You can feel emotion without being taken over. You can remember pain without reliving it. You can plan for the future without obsessing. Because every thought has space to arrive, and more importantly, space to leave. You may even find humor in your mind. A thought appears, ridiculous, dramatic, out of nowhere, and instead of spiraling, you smile. There it goes again. Not mockery, just lightness. Because you've learned the secret. Most thoughts don't need your seriousness. They just need your space. This changes how you relate to other people too. You become more patient, more open. Because if you can host your own inner chaos with grace, you can host theirs too. You can listen without reacting. You can stay grounded even when others cannot. Your mind becomes a training ground for real compassion. In time, the whole practice becomes second nature. You feel a thought arrive, and you make space. You don't tighten, you don't follow. You just host it lightly, like wind passing through an open window. No resistance, no grip, just flow. And the more you do this, the more peace stays with you. Not because the guests stopped coming, but because you stopped closing the door in fear. So when the next thought knocks, let it in. Offer it presence, not analysis. Let it sit without telling you what to do. Let it leave without demanding it stay. And in that quiet, graceful hosting, you'll find something that no thought can take from you, inner freedom. So, after learning to host thoughts with openness, after realizing that even pain can pass through without damaging your peace, there's an even deeper practice that brings compassion into the heart of suffering. Because sometimes, simply witnessing isn't enough. Sometimes what rises isn't just a guest to host, but a wound that needs care. This is where Tonglen enters, a practice that doesn't push suffering away, but breathes it in, a radical act of inner transformation where pain becomes the doorway to love. Tonglen means giving and receiving, but not in the usual sense. It means breathing in the pain of yourself and others, and breathing out relief. It means not turning from discomfort, but meeting it with compassion so strong it begins to change its shape. This may sound impossible. Why would you want to breathe in pain? But here's the secret. When you stop resisting pain and start embracing it with an open heart, it softens. Not just for you, but for everyone it touches. Most people are trained to avoid discomfort, to fix it, numb it, distract from it. But avoidance doesn't heal, it hides, and what hides grows heavier. Tonglen turns toward that weight and does something revolutionary. It chooses to carry it gently so it can be dissolved. It doesn't do this through logic. It does it through breath, through presence, through a kind of love that expects nothing in return. You begin by sitting still, a simple breath in, and then, instead of avoiding the difficult emotion, fear, grief, shame, you breathe it in, fully, consciously, as if saying, you don't have to hide anymore. You allow the pain to be felt, not because you want to suffer, but because you want to open. And as you breathe out, you send peace, not as a wish, but as an offering. May this be eased. May this transform. May I and others be free. Tonglen isn't metaphorical. You're not pretending. You're metabolizing, taking in the raw energy of suffering and sending out warmth, like turning fire into water, like turning noise into silence. And in this process, the thought no longer feels like an enemy. It becomes part of the healing. This practice is especially powerful when negative thoughts feel personal, when they sting, when they echo shame or anger or hopelessness. Tonglen teaches you to meet those thoughts not with resistance, but with care. This thought is hurting. This feeling is heavy. I breathe it in with compassion. And when you exhale, may this soften, may this dissolve, may I hold this with kindness. It's not about pretending to be strong, it's about letting your strength be soft. Most of the time, we armor ourselves against inner pain. Tonglen removes the armor, not to expose you, but to free you, because once the armor is gone, you realize that pain isn't dangerous. It's just unmet tenderness, and Tonglen becomes the way you meet it. You can also practice Tonglen for others. Someone you love is hurting. You breathe in their pain, not to be consumed by it, but to say, you don't carry this alone. You feel their weight as if it's your own, and you breathe out ease, not because you can fix their life, but because you can send love from a place of truth. And here's what's extraordinary. This practice changes the mind. It replaces fear with generosity. It replaces bitterness with compassion. It creates new pathways where pain doesn't lead to reaction, but to connection. That shift is subtle at first, but deep. You begin to meet your own pain differently. You stop pushing it down. You hold it like you'd hold a frightened child. And that holding becomes healing. Tonglen can also be done for the world when the news is heavy, when injustice feels overwhelming, when grief saturates the air. You breathe in the suffering of the world. You don't try to fix it. You don't explain it. You take it in, even just a small piece, and breathe out relief. May they feel supported. May peace touch them. May we all heal. This practice won't change the world overnight, but it changes you. And that's how the world begins to shift, through hearts that choose compassion over avoidance. This kind of breathing doesn't just move air, it moves energy. It shifts how you relate to thought. Suddenly, the negative voice in your mind isn't a threat, it's a signal, a call for kindness. And instead of spiraling, you breathe. You don't push it away, you receive it, you give it space, and you respond with love. Some days, the pain might feel too sharp, the thought too loud. That's okay. Tonglen never asks you to force anything. If you can't breathe it in fully, breathe around it. If you can't send peace, send silence. The intention is enough. The practice is gentle. It meets you where you are. And as you keep doing it, you'll notice something beautiful. The fear that used to grip you, it softens. The shame that once paralyzed you, it loosens. The old thoughts that once made you feel small, they show up and you say, "Come in." And instead of fighting, you breathe. And instead of spiraling, you soften. This is the medicine Tonglen offers. Not escape, but presence that heals. You can practice it anywhere. In silence, in a crowd, in a moment of tension. You feel the constriction rise, you breathe it in, not to absorb it, but to embrace it, and you breathe out whatever the moment needs. Calm, love, lightness. You become a vessel of healing for yourself, for others, for the spaces around you. And over time, your mind becomes more than a container of thoughts. It becomes a place of transformation, a sacred fire that takes pain and turns it into peace, a place where no thought is too dark to be welcomed, where no emotion is too heavy to be held. That's what Tonglen reveals, that your heart is large enough to carry even the deepest suffering and still give something back. So tonight, if something rises, something difficult, something tight, something unresolved, try this. Breathe it in, not with fear, with care, and breathe out something lighter, not with effort, with love. Let this be your offering to yourself. Let this be the start of softening. So, after learning how to breathe through pain, after seeing how compassion can melt suffering without needing to resist it, another door begins to open. A quiet but powerful question rises beneath the practice. If thoughts come and go, if emotions rise and pass, if even pain transforms through awareness, then who is the one all of this is happening to? What is this I that keeps trying to hold it all together? And the answer that begins to reveal itself isn't just surprising, it's freeing. The self that suffers, the one that feels broken, afraid, and constantly not enough, isn't solid. It isn't fixed. It isn't even fully real. And when this is seen clearly, something profound happens. Mental suffering begins to disappear. This isn't philosophy, it's insight. Buddhism doesn't tell you that you don't exist. It shows you that the version of you that you've been identifying with, the one built from stories, thoughts, memories, labels, is a mental construction, a concept, a bundle of patterns mistaken for a person. And this mistaken identity is where most suffering begins. Because when you believe you are the thoughts in your mind, then every negative thought feels like a personal attack. When you believe you are your emotions, then every sadness feels like a defect. When you believe you are your past, then every memory becomes a trap. But when you begin to see that there is no fixed self behind any of it, only change, only process, only awareness, then the weight starts to lift. This realization is not cold or abstract, it's deeply peaceful, because when the self disappears, so does the pressure to fix it, to defend it, to prove it. Most of the tension people carry, trying to be someone, trying to improve someone, trying to fix someone, is built on the belief that this someone is real and fragile. But Buddhism shows that what you've been protecting is a shadow. What you've been improving is a story. When you sit in silence long enough, this becomes more than an idea. You start noticing that every time you look for a self, you find only sensations, thoughts, emotions, no core, no center, just movement, just activity. And yet, awareness sees all of it, unchanging, uninvolved. That awareness isn't a self, it's not personal, but it is steady. It is what remains when everything else changes. And that is the home you've always been looking for. The illusion of self is sticky because it starts early. From childhood, you're taught you are this, you are not that. You're given a name, a role, a list of qualities. Over time, these solidify into identity. I am anxious. I am not good enough. I am always this way. These sentences don't just describe thoughts. They glue thoughts to a fictional self. And once that glue is applied, every experience becomes personal. This is why negative thinking feels so painful. It doesn't just say, there is anger. It says, I am angry, and that means I'm bad. It doesn't say, there is sadness. It says, I am broken. But what if you could meet thoughts without that attachment? What if you could see them arise and fall without grabbing onto them? That's what the insight into emptiness reveals. That nothing in your experience, not even you, is permanent. Emptiness in Buddhism doesn't mean nothingness. It means empty of fixed identity. It means everything, including the self, is made of parts, conditions, interactions. Your mind, your body, your personality. All of it is like a river. No single drop defines it. No fixed point holds it in place. And just like a river flows without being a thing, you flow without being a someone. This doesn't make you vanish. It makes you free. Free from the constant need to defend who you are. Free from the fear of not being enough. Free from the voice that says you must become something to be worthy. Because now you know, the one trying to be worthy was never a fixed person, just a pattern of thought, arising and passing. This also helps you release shame. Shame only exists when there is a solid self to blame. But if there's no fixed self, then mistakes are just actions, not identities. Failures are just events, not personal definitions. You begin to move through life with more softness, more humility, less fear, because there's nothing to protect, nothing to prove. And this insight deepens compassion, not just for yourself, but for others. You stop taking things so personally. When someone lashes out, you see their suffering, not an attack on your identity. When someone struggles, you don't see them as weak. You see them as caught in the same illusion you've known. And this opens the heart. The practice that leads to this insight is mindfulness, watching the mind closely without clinging. You see thoughts arise. You see them pass. You ask, who is this happening to? and you wait. And what you find is not a self, but space, openness, stillness. That space is your true refuge, not the person you think you are, but the awareness that never comes or goes. This realization doesn't make you passive, it makes you wise. You still have a body, a mind, a personality. You still have responsibilities, but you don't mistake any of it for a fixed me. You live lightly, you respond freely, you hold yourself and others more gently. There's a kind of joy that arises here, a joy not dependent on success or validation or image. It's the joy of being nobody in particular, the joy of not having to live up to a story, the joy of meeting each moment fresh without dragging the past behind you. You begin to feel what Buddhists call liberation, not a dramatic escape, but a quiet freedom from the prison of me, a freedom from the need to win or to be right or to be admired, because you've seen that all of those are games played by a self that was never real. You might still forget. The self is persistent. It reappears in thoughts, in reactions, in the voice that says, "You're not doing this right." But now you know that voice isn't truth, it's habit, and you don't have to listen. You return to awareness. You feel the breath. You rest in the space beneath identity, and the self disappears again, not through effort, but through insight. This doesn't make life empty, it makes life full, because now you can meet the world without filters, without fear, without needing to protect your image. You can be present, awake, free. So the next time a thought rises and tries to tell you who you are, pause, breathe. Ask, is this thought real, or is it just passing? And when the answer comes, let it go. Return to what doesn't pass. The stillness, the openness, the space where nothing is fixed and everything is possible. So once the self begins to dissolve, once the tight grip of identity starts loosening, and you see through the illusion that a fixed I is behind every thought, there comes a deeper curiosity. If thoughts no longer belong to a permanent self, then where do they come from? What drives them to arise? What keeps them circling, especially the ones that disturb your peace the most? The answer in Buddhism lies in something ancient and practical, the 5 hindrances. These are not just obstacles to meditation. They are the hidden engines behind most repetitive, negative thought patterns. And when you learn to see them clearly, they lose their grip. The 5 hindrances, desire, ill will, sloth, restlessness, and doubt, are like the background programs running inside the mind. You might not see them directly, but they power the thoughts you can't seem to escape. They aren't bad in a moral sense, but they are heavy, sticky, persistent. They create emotional weight, narrow perspective, and feed the illusion that something is wrong, either with you or with life. Understanding them is not about control, it's about recognition. And recognition is the first step to release. The first hindrance is desire, not the kind that leads to joy or love, but the craving kind, the hunger for something more, something better, something else. This shows up as longing in the mind, a constant leaning forward. It whispers, "You need this to be happy," and attaches itself to thoughts about success, pleasure, admiration, escape. When desire takes over, your thoughts begin circling around what's missing, what you don't have yet, what you wish could fill the moment. But the craving itself creates the suffering, not the absence of the object, but the inability to rest with what is. The antidote to desire isn't denial, it's contentment. When you sit with desire without feeding it, something shifts. You breathe into the ache, you feel the tightness in the body, you notice the mental reaching, and slowly you let it go. Not the object, but the grasping. This doesn't kill motivation, it clears illusion. You still care, you still act, but now your thoughts are no longer trapped in hunger. The second hindrance is ill will. This is anger, resentment, judgment toward others or yourself. It gives rise to aggressive thoughts, defensive stories, mental arguments that replay over and over. It makes you sharp, tense, reactive, and the worst part is, it often feels justified. They were wrong. I was mistreated. This shouldn't have happened. But holding on to that story keeps the mind inflamed. The thought may feel protective, but it poisons the space it lives in. Meeting ill will starts with noticing how it feels. The heat, the contraction, the narrow focus. Then softening. Not forcing kindness, but remembering your own pain. The pain that causes others to lash out. The pain that fuels your own reaction. This doesn't excuse anything, it just opens perspective. And that opening allows the thought to break. You see it, feel it, release it, and the tension starts to drain. The third hindrance is sloth and torpor. This one is sneaky. It doesn't shout, it dulls. It clouds the mind with heaviness. Thoughts become slow, muddy, repetitive in a passive way. You don't feel agitated, you feel disconnected. You say things like, "I don't care," or "What's the point?" And underneath that is a subtle aversion to being fully present. It's not sleepiness, it's a turning away from experience. The way out of this fog is not forcing energy, it's rekindling interest. Bringing attention to something simple, the breath, the weight of the body, a sound. You anchor yourself in now, not with pressure, but with warmth. Slowly, the dullness lifts, light returns. Thoughts gain clarity, not because you made them sharper, but because you reconnected to aliveness. The fourth hindrance is restlessness. This is the mind that won't stop moving, that jumps from one thought to the next, searching, scanning, planning, worrying. It often masks itself as productivity, but underneath is anxiety. A fear that stillness means failure, that quiet means danger. So the mind races to stay ahead. To work with restlessness, you don't chase the thoughts. You sit still. You feel the pulse of energy in your chest, your limbs. You acknowledge the fear behind the speed, and you let yourself stop. At first, it may feel unbearable, like you're missing something, but that's just the addiction to movement speaking. When you stay anyway, restlessness loses its power. The thoughts stop galloping, space returns. The fifth and final hindrance is doubt. This is not healthy curiosity. It's paralyzing uncertainty. The kind that says, "You're not doing this right. This won't work. Why even try?" It's a voice that erodes trust in yourself, in your path, in life. And when you believe it, your thoughts turn inward, circular, small. The way to face doubt isn't with answers, it's with presence. You sit with the questioning mind and say, "I see you." You don't try to solve every concern, you breathe with them. You feel the ground beneath you. And in time, you realize that doubt doesn't mean stop. It just means pause, observe, continue. You don't need certainty to move forward. You just need clarity. And clarity comes from stillness, not strategy. What ties all 5 hindrances together is their power to hijack thought. They turn the mind into a spinning wheel, always searching, always reacting. But when you recognize them, not as facts, but as temporary weather, you stop being ruled by them. You start noticing their flavor. Ah, this is desire. This is restlessness. And in that noticing, you disarm them. You don't need to push them away. You just need to stop feeding them. Each hindrance leaves a trail in the mind. You feel it in tone, in tension, in the pull of your attention. The practice is to gently bring yourself back. Not harshly, not with judgment, with understanding. You breathe, you name the energy, you stay. And as this becomes your habit, the machinery behind negative thinking begins to fall apart. Thoughts that once controlled you now feel lighter, less sticky, more transparent. You start choosing how to respond instead of being pulled into old patterns. You develop what Buddhism calls mental purification, not through force, but through wise seeing. This changes how you experience yourself. You no longer think, "I am angry," or "I am scattered." You say, "Anger is here. Restlessness is present." That shift in language is a shift in consciousness. It means you are not the hindrance. You are the one watching it arise and pass. You can even begin the day with this awareness. As thoughts arise, ask, which hindrance is feeding this? And when you name it, something loosens. You don't make it personal. You don't spiral. You just return. And with each return, the mind becomes clearer, lighter, stronger. This doesn't mean the hindrances disappear forever. They are part of the human condition. But when they are seen, they lose their grip. When they are acknowledged, they stop hiding. And when they stop hiding, you stop suffering blindly. So the next time your mind feels heavy, busy, dull, doubtful, or hungry, pause, breathe, name what's here. And remember, the thought is not the enemy. The hindrance is not a flaw. It's just a signal. And you, in your awareness, are free to respond, not with fear, not with control, but with clarity. So after recognizing the hidden engines behind your negative thoughts, after seeing how desire, ill will, sloth, restlessness, and doubt quietly steer the mind, you begin to understand something much more important. Awareness alone is powerful. Naming the hindrances weakens them. But there's another step. You don't just see, you release. And that release, when done with care and not force, leads to something few people ever realize. Letting go isn't abandonment. It's not cold. It's not denial. In Buddhism, detachment, real detachment, is an act of deep compassion. This often confuses people. Detachment sounds like disconnection, like apathy, like giving up. But that's not what the Buddha taught. Buddhist detachment is not about turning your back on yourself. It's about holding your experience with so much kindness, so much wisdom, that you no longer cling to what hurts you. You don't abandon yourself, you abandon your need to hold pain in place. The confusion starts because we're conditioned to equate love with holding on. We think if we let go of a thought, a feeling, a memory, we're betraying something. But in truth, holding on is what keeps the wound open. Real compassion says, I love this part of me enough to not keep it trapped in suffering. I love myself enough to set this free. Thoughts come and go. That's their nature. But we cling, we replay, we identify, and the more tightly we hold, the more tightly we suffer. The voice says, if you let go, you'll lose yourself. But what you're really losing is the attachment to a version of yourself that was never peaceful to begin with. This is where detachment becomes healing. It's not that you push the thought away, it's that you see it, you care for it, and you release it, not because it's wrong, but because it no longer serves. You can love something and still let it go. You can understand a thought and still not build a home inside it. This form of letting go is soft, not aggressive. You don't detach to disconnect. You detach to breathe again. When the mind is full of clinging to past events, to imagined futures, to old stories about who you are, it has no room for presence. Detachment clears that space. It opens the heart. It says, you don't need to carry this anymore. Buddhist compassion is not sentimentality. It's clarity. It's seeing that suffering exists, that it's real, that it hurts, and still choosing not to build your identity around it. You care for the pain, but you don't become it. You meet the thought with gentleness, and then you bow to it as it leaves. Some people fear that if they let go of their stories, they won't know who they are. That without their pain, they'll feel empty. But here's the truth. The space that opens up isn't emptiness. It's freedom. It's the space where peace begins to grow, where joy has room to breathe, where you're no longer defined by the things you've survived. Detachment becomes the highest form of self-respect. Not because you stop feeling, but because you stop clinging to feelings that harm you. You stop trying to fix or control what arises. You start allowing, not passively, not numb, but with presence, with trust. This trust doesn't mean the pain won't come. It means the pain doesn't have to stay. You don't hold on to it out of habit. You meet it, feel it, learn from it, and then let it pass. Not because you're heartless, but because you finally understand that clinging is not care. And here's where compassion deepens. Because when you learn to do this with your own mind, you learn to do it with others. You stop trying to fix people, to control them, to carry them. You begin to see that loving someone doesn't mean absorbing their pain. It means being with them fully, without clinging to who they should be. You give them the same gift you've given yourself: space. Detachment is the space where true love begins. The kind of love that says, I see you. I don't need to hold you. I don't need to fix you. I just need to be present. That presence is healing. That's what people long for. Not someone who clings to them, but someone who can sit beside them with an open heart. In meditation, this shows up clearly. A painful thought arises, maybe something about your past, maybe something you're ashamed of. The old habit says, fix this, judge it, analyze it. But now you try something different. You breathe. You notice the thought. You say, I see you, and you let it go, not with force, with grace. The mind might resist. It might say, but this is important. You can't just drop it. And you reply, I'm not dropping the truth. I'm dropping the suffering. Because the truth doesn't need to hurt. The truth just needs to be seen and allowed to move. This practice gets deeper with time. You start to notice how much you've been carrying, not just thoughts, but roles, expectations, fears, the need to be someone specific in order to feel safe. And with each breath, you loosen that grip. You say, I don't need to be this version anymore. And the pressure drops. Letting go becomes a habit, a new kind of strength. Not detachment in the cold sense, but a warm, steady release. You're still here. You still care. But you're no longer trapped in the mental loops that once defined your identity. Some people mistake detachment for isolation, but Buddhist detachment is intimate. It allows you to get closer to your experience than ever before, because now you're not afraid of what you find. You can meet grief, joy, anger, and longing without being overwhelmed. You can say hello and goodbye to each feeling without losing yourself in either. This also applies to your dreams, your hopes, your plans. You still move forward. You still want things, but you hold them lightly. You say, I care for this, but I don't need it to complete me. That's compassion. That's freedom. You live fully without clinging. Even in deep pain, this compassion remains. A negative thought returns. It stings. It spirals. But now you pause. You breathe. You say, yes, this hurts, and I will not fight it, and I will not become it. That is the voice of loving detachment, the voice of someone who has finally learned how to care for themselves. This isn't a distant goal, it's a moment-by-moment practice. Every time you let a thought pass without holding it, you're detaching. Every time you soften instead of judge, you're detaching. Every time you stay with yourself instead of abandoning your breath to chase a story, you're detaching. And each time you do that, you're building a new home inside yourself. One that doesn't depend on perfection. One that doesn't demand control. One that simply says, you are safe here, even when thoughts are loud. Even when the past visits, even when nothing is certain. So the next time something hard arises, meet it like an old friend. Listen, feel, and when the time comes, let it go. Not because it's unimportant, but because it has finished speaking. And when you let go, don't close the door. Keep it open. Let life come and go. Let thoughts come and go. Let yourself come and go without fear, without clinging. So once detachment is understood as compassion, once the pressure to carry and cling dissolves into gentleness, a different kind of silence begins to surface. Not the silence that comes from effort, but the one that was always underneath. Yet even in this quiet, there's something left to notice. A heaviness that doesn't feel like tension or resistance, but weariness. Not emotional exhaustion, not physical fatigue, something deeper. A kind of inner tiredness that follows the mind wherever it goes. This is thought tiredness. The exhaustion that builds when the mind thinks too much for too long about everything and nothing. And it's one of the most overlooked causes of chronic negativity. You may not realize how much energy it takes to think. Not just the conscious effort of problem solving, but the constant low-level chatter that never stops. Planning, predicting, remembering, defending, rehearsing, all of it consumes attention. All of it eats space, and when there's no break, the mind starts to wear down. Thoughts get heavier, emotions turn flat, small problems feel large. The world begins to feel overwhelming, not because of what's happening, but because the mind is simply too tired to see clearly. Buddhism recognizes this as a subtle but serious obstacle on the path, not because it's dramatic, but because it's invisible. You wake up and the thoughts start moving. You check your phone. You respond to messages. You play out scenarios in your head. You reflect on things you said. You imagine future conversations. You try to control how you feel. You try to understand what others are thinking. All of it seems normal, but beneath that surface, the mental engine is overheating, and once it does, clarity disappears. This isn't about intelligence, it's about noise. Even a wise mind collapses under too much thinking. That's why clarity is often found not in the next thought, but in the space between them. The quiet moments when the mind stops reaching and awareness is finally allowed to rest. Chronic overthinking doesn't always feel like chaos. Sometimes it just feels like low-level frustration, irritability, fog, a sense that nothing's quite right, even when nothing's obviously wrong. That's the signal. The brain isn't broken, it's overloaded, not because it's weak, but because it hasn't been given silence. And this is where Buddhist practice becomes medicine. Not through analysis, but through rest. Not sleep, not distraction, true rest. A kind of inner stillness that doesn't require entertainment, stimulation, or effort. The kind of rest that only happens when thinking stops being the default state of existence. Meditation offers this not as a luxury, but as a necessity. It's not just about calming the nervous system, it's about uncluttering the mental field. It's about letting the mind drop into quiet, not to avoid life, but to restore the strength to meet it. Because when the mind is always on, it never gets to recharge. And when it doesn't recharge, every thought starts sounding like a problem. This is why silence isn't just peaceful, it's essential. But it has to be real silence, not just the absence of noise, but the absence of grasping, a full stop. A return to stillness that doesn't need answers, doesn't chase understanding, doesn't fix anything, just breath, just presence. In the beginning, this can feel strange. You sit to rest, and the mind starts panicking. You're wasting time. You should be doing something. This is boring. But these are just the last echoes of momentum. If you stay, if you breathe through it, the noise begins to fall away. Not because you suppressed it, but because you finally stopped feeding it. Thought tiredness is not a flaw, it's a signal, a message from the body and mind saying, please stop holding everything. And when you listen, something beautiful happens. You don't just feel relaxed, you feel spacious. Thoughts lose their urgency. The mind remembers how to breathe. In this space, clarity returns, and with it, compassion. Because now you're no longer fighting yourself. You're no longer adding more thinking to the pile of thoughts. You're resting from the identity that needs to constantly figure everything out. This rest doesn't mean giving up. It means stopping long enough to realize you were never as stuck as you thought. It means stepping back far enough to see that most of your problems were magnified by the lens of exhaustion. It also means returning to a more natural rhythm. The mind isn't meant to think non-stop. Just like the heart rests between beats, the mind needs pauses between thoughts. Not forced, but allowed. And those pauses don't just feel good, they heal. You may notice that after even a short period of deep stillness, you're not just calmer, you're wiser. You speak with more care, you respond with more grace, you feel less reactive, not because you thought your way into it, but because silence revealed what thought had buried. This kind of rest also helps you reconnect with your body. Overthinking pulls you into your head. You forget your breath. You ignore tension. You miss signals of hunger, fatigue, emotion. But when the thinking slows, sensation returns. You start to feel grounded again. You remember that peace isn't an idea, it's a feeling, and it's already here, under the noise. Buddhist practice invites this kind of rest every day, even a few minutes, not as escape, but as return. A return to awareness without the pressure to do or understand. A return to a mind that doesn't always need stimulation to feel alive. You can begin by noticing when the mind feels overused, the tightness in the forehead, the shallowness of the breath, the feeling of spinning. These are your cues. You pause, you sit, you breathe without trying to think, not to push thought away, but to no longer give it the center of your attention. That shift alone begins to heal the exhaustion, and the more you practice this, the more natural it becomes. You start to crave silence, not because you're escaping, but because your system finally remembers that it was never designed to run on constant output. This also changes your relationship with productivity. You stop measuring your worth by how much you've thought through, how much you've figured out. You start recognizing that insight comes from stillness, not stress. You begin to trust that the most important answers often arrive when the mind is silent enough to hear them. Even creativity is reborn here. The best ideas don't come from grinding, they emerge from openness. The mind at rest is fertile ground. It receives, it listens, it allows space for newness. And you begin to see that you're not missing anything, you're just tired. And silence is the cure. You don't need to retreat into a monastery to feel this. A few breaths, a quiet walk, sitting without your phone, lying down and watching the ceiling without needing to think. These are sacred acts, acts of kindness toward your own mind, toward the life inside you that has grown weary of noise. And slowly, thought tiredness becomes less frequent, not because life stops being complex, but because your mind stops reacting to complexity with endless commentary. You trust silence more than strategy. You let things be unclear without collapsing. You let yourself rest without guilt. So when the day feels too loud, when thoughts start looping, when everything feels heavier than it should, don't reach for another answer. Reach for silence, not as avoidance, but as medicine. Breathe, stop, let go, and allow the healing to begin where thinking ends. So after realizing that thought tiredness isn't a weakness, but a message, after giving the mind the silence it's been begging for, you begin to notice something even deeper, a place where the mind keeps moving even when you're not awake. A layer beneath waking thought. It doesn't come through to-do lists or problem solving. It speaks in symbols, emotions, fragments of memory. It's where pain continues even after you've fallen asleep. And it's also where healing can begin in a way waking life can't touch. This is the Dharma of dreams. the forgotten doorway where Buddhist practice continues after the body lies still and the conscious mind fades. Buddhism teaches that the mind never truly stops unless it is trained to do so. Even in sleep, it moves, it processes, it replays, and for most people, that process is chaotic. Dreams recycle unresolved stress, unspoken emotion, buried thought patterns, and when the dream state is left unconscious, those patterns continue unchecked. You may wake up exhausted, confused, or even anxious without knowing why. But Buddhist sleep meditation offers something radical. What if you could bring mindfulness into your dreams? What if rest itself could be transformed into liberation? This practice begins before sleep even arrives. Because how you fall asleep matters. If the last thing you do before bed is scroll through your phone, worry about tomorrow, replay conversations, or judge yourself for what you didn't accomplish, that mental noise doesn't vanish, it sinks deeper. It enters the dream state, unresolved. It becomes the fuel for subconscious negativity. But if you enter sleep with awareness, with care, with intention, everything changes. Buddhist sleep meditation isn't about lucid dreaming or controlling what happens in your dreams. It's about planting seeds, gentle attention. You lie down, close your eyes, and return to your breath. You acknowledge what's still spinning in the mind, worries, fears, thoughts, and you don't push them away. You greet them, breathe through them, and begin to soften their hold. The goal is not to silence the mind forcefully, but to lull it into stillness, like calming a restless animal, not through command, but through safety, through presence. And as the body relaxes, as breath becomes slower, you begin to offer yourself a simple intention. Let this sleep be healing. Let this dream be clear. Let awareness stay present even in rest. This is the doorway. Not dramatic, not magical, just clear. And what happens next is not in your control, but it is influenced by your energy. The mind enters dream states, but now it has a compass, a quiet inner direction that allows the deeper layers of thought to surface and be seen, not by thinking them, but by dreaming them into release. Many dreams are expressions of unresolved fear. They show up as strange images, impossible scenarios, intense emotions. They seem random, but they carry meaning. The subconscious speaks a language that can't be understood by logic, but it can be met with awareness. If you wake in the middle of the night, remember the feeling of the dream. Don't analyze it. Don't try to make it fit. Just feel. Breathe. Let your presence meet what was hidden. This simple act begins to transform the role of dreams in your life. They stop being leftovers of waking stress. They become lessons, teachers, opportunities to touch what's too subtle or too buried to face directly in daylight. And with sleep meditation as your tool, you train the mind to dissolve patterns during rest that would take years to unravel through talking and thinking. It's important to know that the subconscious doesn't resist healing, it just needs safety. Sleep is when the mind stops defending itself, when ego is quiet, when the stories fall away. And that is the perfect time to let compassion in, to allow peace to reach parts of you that thinking could never access. You may find, over time, that sleep becomes lighter, not in depth, but in quality. You wake Not just rested, but clearer, more stable, less haunted. Because while you slept, something inside was processing, not through thought, but through attention without force. This is the work of sleep meditation, not to eliminate dreaming, but to guide it gently toward purification. One powerful practice is to recite a mantra softly in the mind as you fall asleep. Something simple, something kind. Not to chant your way into sleep, but to anchor the awareness. This mantra becomes the thread that stays with you as consciousness fades. It doesn't always carry into the dream directly, but it sets the tone. It tells the subconscious, you're not alone. You're being watched by love. Another practice is to release judgment around what the dreams contain. You may dream of things that feel dark, confusing, or even disturbing. That's okay. You're not doing it wrong. You're simply touching what's been waiting for attention. And now, it doesn't need to stay hidden. Let the images come. Let the emotions rise. Let them pass. Don't fix them. Don't decode them. Just let them move through the deeper layers of mind like clouds through sky. Eventually, a shift happens. You no longer dread sleep. You don't collapse into it out of exhaustion. You enter it with reverence, with awareness, with the same care you give to your breath, your body, your waking life. Because now you know, sleep isn't a break from practice, it's part of the path. And with that shift, the boundary between waking and dreaming begins to soften. You wake up with insights you didn't try to create. You move through the day with less mental weight. You find that certain repetitive thoughts have simply dissolved, not because you conquered them, but because you released them during sleep. This is how subconscious negativity begins to clear, not by willpower, but by making peace with the unconscious. Buddhist sleep meditation offers that bridge, not to dominate the dream world, but to love it, to let it teach, to let it heal. And the best part is, this practice doesn't require perfection. It doesn't matter if your dreams are vivid or vague, if you remember them or forget them. What matters is your intention, your attitude, your willingness to fall asleep not as a way to escape life, but as a continuation of presence. Each night becomes sacred. Each moment before sleep becomes an invitation, not to think more, but to feel more deeply, to rest more fully, to let the mind be rebalanced, not through effort, but through surrender. So tonight, when you lie down, pause. Let the breath slow. Let the mind rest in kindness and whisper silently to yourself. Let whatever comes be held in peace. Let whatever needs to leave be released. Let this night be soft. And sleep will answer. After walking through these teachings, after breathing with pain instead of pushing it away, after letting thoughts come without building them into prisons, after discovering that the self behind the noise is not fixed but fluid, you've done something extraordinary. Not because you tried to win over your thoughts, but because you stopped believing they were your enemy. You've seen that silence is not emptiness, but peace. That non-reaction isn't weakness, but wisdom. That detachment is not abandonment, but care in its purest form. You've been guided through the noise behind the noise. You've seen where thoughts begin, before they even have shape. You've stepped into the echoes of old emotions, seen their patterns, and stopped feeding them. You've looked at the inner critic and realized it was a ghost, passed down, not born within you. You've watched thoughts morph like shapeshifters and learned not to chase them. You've unraveled the loops created by habit, by karma, by conditioning, and instead of resisting, you've responded with stillness. You've stood calmly in the storm, let silence be your mirror, broken the secret pact with identity-based thinking. You've walked alongside doubt without needing to run. You've spotted thoughts that were never truly yours and released hidden wants pretending to be needs. You've practiced samatha. You've released the need to fix and returned to presence. You've seen how thoughts return when karma stays and how to clear them through awareness and compassion. You've hosted your mind like a guest house instead of a courtroom. You've breathed through pain using Tonglen, turned dreams into teachers, and found rest in places the world told you to avoid. This wasn't about fixing yourself. It was about remembering what you were before the noise. A quiet strength, a clear awareness, a presence untouched by thought. And if any part of you feels lighter right now, even slightly, then know this: you've already started. The work doesn't end when the video stops. These insights, these tools, these practices, they are seeds, and each night, as your head touches the pillow, they will grow, quietly, naturally, in silence. If this journey touched something in you, if even one lesson opened a door in your heart, leave a comment below and write, "Silence is my strength." Let's see who made it to the end. Let's see who's awake, even while asleep. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell, not for noise, but for more reminders of peace. Thank you for walking this path tonight. Sleep well, sleep aware. And when you wake, may your thoughts be quieter, your heart softer, and your mind free.